Hey, everyone. Bro really started his Ice Guy run on Nightmare difficulty. Level 1. No cheats, no allies, and a dungeon full of monsters. Somehow, that's exactly how he becomes the strongest. So with that said, let's begin the story. The main character stands atop a mountain made of corpses. He knows that in this world, everything comes down to level. A holographic window materializes before the protagonist. On the screen is a creature who says it has been watching the protagonist, whose name is Mizuno Turu. The creature says it is the god the protagonist has longed so desperately to find. The creature notes that Mizuno has achieved a great deal and wants to present him with a gift. The god declares that he is ready to grant the protagonist any wish. He asks what the protagonist would like, to become the highest level character in the world and be the strongest, or to restore the world to the way it was. Mizuno feels as though the creature is mocking him. He has absolutely no desire to go through all that hell again. God calmly replies that he understands Mizuno's feelings. In this world, weak beings who crave life are always doomed to perish. The protagonist smirks. Pointing his sword at the screen, the protagonist swears that one day he'll reach God, and then God will beg for death. The being declares that it will eagerly await that moment. Half a year ago, the protagonist finds himself in some unknown place. Looking around, he concludes that he has ended up in something resembling an old mansion. Mizuno has absolutely no idea what's going on. A voice asks if he received the summons properly. The door swings open, and a man appears in the doorway, with two bodyguards standing behind him. The protagonist has no idea who these people are. With a trembling voice, he timidly asks them to explain what's going on. The man, raising his head haughtily, remarks that although Mizuno is an alien, his intellect isn't much different from that of wild monkeys. He informs him that he summoned the protagonist to this world. A swarm of questions swirls through the protagonist's mind. The man notes that the most important thing is Mizuno's level. An information window pops up before the bewildered protagonist. To the stunned protagonist, the notification looks like a game menu. He sees his own name there. The man asks in disappointment, "Why did I waste so much effort on some pathetic first level?" He explains that summoning is an ancient form of magic. The man had assumed that the summoned creature would be just as powerful as the magic itself. He speaks with disgust about the protagonist, calling him a terrible disappointment. Confused, Mizuno still doesn't understand what's going on. He begs to be sent back to his own world. After a moment's thought, the protagonist falls to his knees. He explains that his sister is very sick and simply won't be able to manage without him. The protagonist insists that he must return. Mizuno's duty is to protect his younger sister, Kana. He recalls how the girl drew a picture of them together. The protagonist asks once again to be sent back to his former world. The man says he can't do that. With a smirk, he adds that it would be utter nonsense. After all, the protagonist is nothing but a pathetic low-level scum. The man doesn't want to waste his energy on such a nobody. Mizuno asks again, his voice trembling. However, the man couldn't care less about the protagonist's feelings. He's far more interested in the protagonist's skill. He's never seen anything like it before. The man would be extremely curious to find out how it works. The skill is called Lord of Poisons and temporarily neutralizes any poison. The man wonders if this ability is valuable or just rare piece of junk. He suddenly reaches out and grabs Mizuno by the throat, tightening his grip. The protagonist tries to break free from the choking hold. The man hopes that the protagonist's skill will at least somewhat make up for the energy spent on summoning him. Mizuno is trembling from the effort, but he can't break free. He opens his mouth wide, trying to catch his breath. The protagonist is stunned by the man's strength. The man smiles cruelly. The protagonist can't break free no matter what he does. It feels as if some kind of monster is squeezing his throat. Mizuno realizes that if he doesn't do something right now, he'll simply die. The protagonist sees information about his tormentor. The man's name is Abadir Argon. His skills are fire magic and summoning magic. The protagonist notices that he is at level 51. Mizuno assumes that's why the man is so strong. Just then, one of the guards politely calls out to Abadir. He gives the go-ahead to speak. The servant points out that there are many poisonous dungeons and suggests using the protagonist to clear them out. Thinking it over, Abadir glances at the protagonist. Tears are streaming from his eyes, and drool is dripping from his half-open mouth. Abadir decides that the servant's idea is quite interesting. Abadir abruptly releases his grip, announcing that he won't kill Mizuno just yet. Mizuno falls to the floor, gasping for air. Abadir adds that the protagonist won't get off so easily. Abadir's body is engulfed in flames. The man briefly explains that he used a skill called fire magic. With a sinister grin, he advises the protagonist, who is kneeling before him, to try not to die. The protagonist looks at the man in confusion. Just then, a spark appears on Mizuno's cheek. A moment later, it grows into a small flame, and then into a blaze. The protagonist glances down at his cheek. He screams in horror, frantically trying to put out the flames. A botter asks him to make more noise, because he wants to have some real fun. The man yanks the protagonist sharply by the hair, lifting him up in one swift motion. The fire goes out immediately. Looking at the protagonist's scorched and tear-streaked face, a botter announces that the burn will now serve as the mark of a slave. The man shoves Mizuno aside, turns around, and orders his servants to throw the protagonist into a dungeon. He adds that tomorrow they will head to the underground. The guards roughly order the protagonist to stand up. Gritting his teeth, he lifts his head. He sees a botanist's back receding into the distance. With his last ounce of strength, Mizuno begs to be sent back to his home world. Turning around, a botter orders them not to give him any orders. He adds that he'll consider sending the protagonist back once the protagonist's level is at least roughly the same as his own. Mizuno asks wearily, "Is that a promise, a botter?" A botter nods. He explains that in this world, everything is determined by level. The protagonist silently watches him walk away. The next day, just as a botter had promised, the protagonist is led into the dungeon. He is bound, and 3 guards are leading him. One of them timidly remarks that it's a very creepy place. His partner rudely shuts him up and hurries him along. The protagonist looks around. But right then, a guard kicks him, demanding that Mizuno move faster or he'll turn him into experience points. The protagonist endures it, reminding himself that if he reaches the same level as a botter will keep his promise. The party enters the dungeon. The guard points to a poisonous swamp. He announces that because of the poison in this area, there aren't even any monsters here. He says there are piles of treasure in the dungeons. The guard explains that you level up by killing monsters, and adds that even a loser like the protagonist is capable of understanding that. His partner looks around impatiently, searching for monsters. He wants to get it all over with as soon as possible and leave the dungeon. The protagonist overhears the guard's conversation. This world is starting to remind him more and more of a video game. There, too, killing monsters levels you up. Mizuno feels like he, too, has a chance to become stronger. As if reading his mind, one of the guards says that the protagonist has nothing to hope for. A botter can roam the dungeons freely, is blessed with incredible skills, and has already reached level 51. Glancing at his palm, the guard adds that mere mortals will never reach such heights. At that moment, a pebble falls from the speaker's hands, and it flies off to the side. Saddened by the guard's words, the protagonist remains silent, his gaze lowered. A sound drifts out of the darkness of the dungeon. The guards peer into the depths of the tunnel. Someone's hand rests on a rock. A monster climbs onto the boulder. The guards are quite pleased to have finally spotted the monster. To Mizuno, the monster seems rather weak. Outwardly, the creature resembles a toad with human hands instead of feet. The guards, it seems, share the protagonist's opinion about the monster's strength. One of them, drawing his blade and smirking, declares that it's a waste of time to bother with such a weak creature. His comrade wants to finish off the monster as quickly as possible. The guard declares that he will deal with this creature himself and summons lightning strike. A flash appears, and a bolt of electricity strikes the monster directly. The guard smirks smugly, thinking the job is done. However, the monster simply hops up as if nothing had happened. The guard is bewildered to discover that the monster doesn't have a single scratch on it. Suddenly, a long tongue shoots out of the creature's mouth. It wraps itself around the man's head. The man doesn't have time to comprehend what's happening. His skull shatters, exploding in a fountain of blood. The splatter lands on the protagonist's cheek, and he freezes with his eyes wide open. The guards realize with horror that their comrade was killed with a single blow, despite being at level 18. Suddenly, the monster opens its mouth wide. A massive torso, crowned with a toothy snout, emerges from it. The information states that the monster is called Hikato, possesses the skills Tongue Strike and Leap, and is at level 117. This latest news sends the guards into a state of shock and horror. A monster like this simply shouldn't be here. The moment Mizuno saw the monster's powerful paw clamp down on a guard and its strong teeth tear through his body, he immediately understood everything. Staring at the monster's shadow on the wall, the protagonist realized this creature is on an entirely different level. And, as the protagonist already knows, in this world, everything depends on one's level. Against the strong, weaklings like Mizuno simply don't survive. A monstrous creature looms over the protagonist. Blood and saliva drip from its jaws. Tears stream from the protagonist's eyes. All Mizuno can do is laugh nervously. Seeing the monster right in front of him, the protagonist realizes that the level gap between him and the monster is too great. If he can't escape, he'll die. The guards, their eyes wide with horror, scream that they can't kill such a powerful monster. They flee, hoping to save themselves. With a trembling voice, the protagonist begs them to stop. But it's too late. The monster has already spotted the protagonist. Looking at its gaping maw, Mizuno realizes it's all over for him. There's nowhere to run, and there's no escape. The monster strains and pushes off the ground with such force that rocks fly off to the side. The shocked protagonist crouches down. The guards run toward the exit. One of them remarks with a laugh that even a piece of trash can be useful. He turns around, and the smile slips from his face. Behind him is only the protagonist, curled up into a ball, and the monster is nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, saliva drips in front of the guard. Looking up, the man sees the monster's gaping maw above him, with its deadly tongue hanging out. In the next instant, the monster lunges forward, and falling rocks block the protagonist's view of what's happening. Shocked, Mizuno realizes that the monster hasn't touched him. The monster devours the guard. Its mouth is smeared with blood. The monster slowly turns its gaze toward the protagonist. He takes a step, and with a scream, he breaks into a run. The protagonist realizes that the monster has simply saved him for last. The monster sticks out its tongue. Glancing back as he runs, Mizuno realizes with horror that the monster is too fast. There's no escaping it. The tongue slams into the rock next to the protagonist with all its might. Shards fly in all directions. At the last second, the protagonist manages to dodge it and take cover behind a ledge. He hears the monster approaching, searching for its prey. Mizuno, in a panic, tries to figure out what to do. He may have managed to dodge it this time, but next time a monster will definitely hit him. Clutching his head in desperation, the protagonist tries with all his might to figure out how to get out of this alive. The monster's enormous paw lands on the ledge. The protagonist can clearly see his reflection in the creature's eyes. Without waiting for the monster's next move, Mizuno crawls away on all fours. He pushes himself forward with the thought that he can't give up. After all, he needs to get home. The monster sticks out its tongue. The tip of it grazes the protagonist. He falls onto his back, try to dodge it. To his horror, the protagonist realizes there is no floor beneath him. He sees that a poisonous swamp awaits him. Mizuno remembers that if he falls into it, he'll definitely die. But he has no way out. With a splash, the protagonist plunges into the swamp. Desperately spitting out the water, he surfaces. The protagonist must escape the dungeon as soon as possible. Mizuno notices that the rope on his hands is dissolving from the poison. The protagonist realizes this is his chance. The protagonist makes his way across the swamp and grabs hold of a ledge. And he pulls himself up, trying to reach solid ground. Mizuno is stunned to see that the monster isn't attacking him. The protagonist surmises that the poisonous swamp is very dangerous for the monster. Only then does he realize that he himself has fallen into it. The protagonist doesn't know why he doesn't feel any pain. He's no longer sure the swamp is poisonous. Mizuno scoops up a little of the liquid, and he sniffs it. He notes with disgust that the smell is very strange. But now it's clear that the swamp is definitely very poisonous. Taking his hand away from his face, the protagonist remembers his skill. He brings up the information window. He reads about the ability, poison neutralization. The protagonist realizes that since he remains safe and sound after falling into the swamp, so the skill really works. He decides to just wait until the monster leaves. However, the monster has no intention of giving up. It lets out a roar and sticks out its tongue, and Mizuno barely manages to dive out of the way of the attack. He notices that the monster is being far too persistent. The protagonist thinks the monster will leave sooner or later anyway, so for now he can wait in the swamp. But it's not that simple. A notification pops up in front of the protagonist. It warns that the neutralization power has reached its limit. The protagonist must get out of the poison source within 1 minute. Unable to take it anymore, the protagonist gets angry, deciding that this is some kind of mockery. He feels the air running out, and he surfaces. Looking around, Mizuno quickly presses himself against a ledge. He hopes the monster will forget about him if he doesn't stick his head out. However, the protagonist can't stay in the swamp for long. A timer appears on the screen. The skill will remain active for another 45 seconds. Mizuno believes there must be a way out. Looking around, the protagonist notices a small ledge in the stone wall. He realizes there's no time for hesitation and he needs to act. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist dives in. He can't stop now. There are only 38 seconds left. Once underwater, Mizuno swims with all his might. 26 seconds remain. The protagonist pushes himself as hard as he can. He surfaces to take a breath. The timer shows 18 seconds. The protagonist starts swimming again, urging himself on. There are 10 seconds left when Mizuno swims up to the surface. He grabs for the rocks, but his palms slip. Cursing desperately, the protagonist tries to pull himself up. He realizes with horror that there's very little time left, 3 seconds. The protagonist looks up and sees roots above him. As he leaps, he grabs hold of one of them and hangs there. Time is running out. Mizuno exhales with relief, and he steps onto the rock. He realizes he made it in time. A sound catches the protagonist's attention. He turns around and sees the monster standing opposite him. The protagonist realizes that the monster can reach him. The monster shoots out its tongue. The tip is already very close to Mizuno, and he knows he can't dodge it. The tongue is right in front of the protagonist's eyes, which are wide with terror. The tip is just a millimeter from the protagonist's face, but that's as far as it goes, and the tongue retracts. Mizuno gasps nervously. The monster barks, and then it turns around and walks away. The protagonist smiles uncertainly, realizing he succeeded. Just as the protagonist had suspected, the tongue has a limit beyond which it cannot extend. Mizuno notices that the monster hasn't left. He doesn't understand what it's about to do. The monster opens its mouth wide, and it tenses the body. In an instant, it spits out the body of one of the guards. The corpse falls onto the ledge in front of the protagonist. He tries to hold back the urge to vomit, but he can't hold it in, and it all comes rushing out. The protagonist wipes his mouth with his hand and decides he needs to get out of the dungeon as soon as possible. He steps away from the guard's corpse. A dark opening looms ahead of the protagonist. Mizuno recalls that the exit must be roughly in that direction, if he's not mistaken, of course. The protagonist walks down the tunnel. Soon enough, he does indeed find himself at the exit. The protagonist stops. He doesn't know what to do next. If Mizuno goes back to a botter will simply kill him. The protagonist's mind flashes back to the recent encounter with the monster. The protagonist looks uncertainly at his hand. His skill for neutralizing poison is indeed quite good. Mizuno recalls a botter's promise and his words that, in this world, level is everything. Clenching his fist, the protagonist makes a decision. He intends to continue hunting monsters in this dungeon and use that to raise his level. If he manages to carry out his plan, a botter will take him home. Mizuno recalls his sister's smile, her voice, the way she calls out to him, turning away from the exit. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist silently asks Kana to wait for him. The protagonist heads back into the dungeon, determined to level up and become incredibly strong. Mizuno realizes that right now, he needs to find at least some kind of weapon. Something catches the protagonist's eye. Something glitters on the stone floor. As it gets closer, the protagonist sees that it's the gear of slain soldiers. Grimacing, Mizuno realizes that a monster must have spat it out. The guards treated the protagonist brutally. However, if he fails and loses, then the same fate awaits him, to be devoured by the monster. Shaken by this thought, the protagonist helplessly sinks to his knees. Tears stream from his eyes. Mizuno tells himself to calm down, because now is neither the time nor the place for doubts. Sighing, folding his hands, the protagonist drops to his knees and says he'll borrow the guard's gear for a little while. The protagonist gets dressed, adjusting his gear uncertainly. He glances at the blade and bends down to pick it up. Mizuno grabs the hilt and gasps from strain. Trembling from the effort, the protagonist doesn't understand why he can't lift the sword. A message appears. The protagonist discovers that there is a level restriction. Mizuno turns back in disappointment to the equipment he had to leave behind. It's now clear to him that physical stats in this world depend on level. The protagonist simply doesn't have enough strength to use the equipment left behind by the guards. He examines the item information. The equipment levels vary, but none are below level 10. Mizuno can't do anything about it. He has no choice but to take a level 1 knife. It's the only thing he can use. The protagonist decides that a knife is still better than nothing. The protagonist examines his backpack and notices that there's very little food and water left. He needs to get more supplies. Mizuno realizes that before he can begin exploring the dungeon, he needs to figure out how to defeat the monsters on the first level. The protagonist doesn't know what he's capable of. His skill simply neutralizes the effects of poison. The only option that comes to the protagonist's mind is to use the poison to his advantage. Mizuno thoughtfully dips his hand into the swamp. The protagonist ponders how he can use his skill to destroy monsters. He hasn't yet figured out how his ability works. Mizuno notices the guard's corpse. Although the protagonist feels sick to his stomach, he still feels obligated to examine the body. He approaches the corpse and asks for forgiveness. The protagonist drags the body, but not noticing a rock, he stumbles. He falls, and the body crashes down on top of him. With a cry, Mizuno sits up. Noticing something, he recoils sharply. He sees that the corpse has fallen into the swamp. The guard's head vanishes in an instant, and his arm is being eaten away right before the protagonist's eyes. With a cry, the protagonist crawls away from the swamp. Only now does he realize just how dangerous this poison is. Mizuno decides he can use this to his advantage. An unexpected idea pops into his head. Drawing his blade, the protagonist drops to his knees, and he dips the knife into the swamp. If everything goes as the protagonist planned, he'll be able to kill monsters even with a weapon like this. Mizuno prays that everything will go well. He pulls out the knife, hoping he's kept it in the swamp long enough. The protagonist examines the information about the blade. The message states that this knife is poisoned. It is coated with a powerful poison. Even a small cut is enough to poison the target. The minimum level required to use the weapon is 1. After reading the information, Mizuno breaks into a happy smile. He's glad that his plan has succeeded. The protagonist would like to take some of the poison with him to later apply it to a more powerful weapon. He tries to scoop some into a bag, but finds that it dissolves almost immediately. Pulling out what's left of the bag, the protagonist realizes that the poison corrodes ordinary items in just a few minutes. He tosses the ruined bag aside. Mizuno falls deep in thought. The poison would be very useful to the protagonist in fighting monsters, but he has no suitable container to carry it in. An idea pops into the protagonist's head, but he dismisses it. He doesn't want to take such a risk and tries to come up with something else. However, Mizuno immediately decides to cast aside any doubts. Now is not the right time for that, and besides, he has no other choice. He decides to give it a try. Several hours pass. No one shows up here at all. The protagonist doesn't understand where all the monsters have gone. He considers venturing deeper into the dungeon, but then he decides not to go any further, so as not to get lost. Just then, a hissing sound reaches the protagonist's ears. Mizuno realizes that the monster has arrived. A dog-like monster growls as it approaches the rock behind which the protagonist is hiding. He frantically looks up information on the monster and is horrified to discover that the creature is level 79. The monster sniffs the air. He bared his teeth and growled again. The protagonist tries to calm himself down, telling himself that he doesn't necessarily have to fight the monster head-on. Still, this creature is of a much lower level than the previous monster. Mizuno reassures himself that the plan will definitely work. The monster approaches. Its nostrils quiver as it sniffs the air. The protagonist tries to time his move just right. Deciding that the time has come, he jumps to his feet abruptly and waves his arms, drawing the monster's attention. The monstrous creature spots the protagonist. Mizuno is horrified to see just how big his enemy is. The creature growls, standing face to face with the main character. Mizuno doesn't know what to do. The monster doesn't approach him, no matter how much Mizuno tries to lure it. Glancing back, the protagonist realizes that the monster is afraid of the poisonous swamp, which is why it's staying put. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist realizes he has no other choice. He'll have to get within the creature's attack range. The protagonist takes a step forward. The dog makes the same move. Mizuno approaches, and the monster follows suit. The protagonist takes a step, and so does the monster. The protagonist freezes, and the monster lunges forward with a menacing growl. It opens its mouth wide. The monster lunges at Mizuno. Mizuno doesn't have time to keep up with the beast's movements. However, the protagonist isn't worried. His eyes sparkle. The protagonist abruptly spits out the poison he's gathered in his mouth. It hits the monster right in the face. The creature's single eye bulges wildly, and the creature collapses to the floor with a howl. Mizuno realizes this is his chance. He lunges at the screeching beast, determined to finish it off. The protagonist jumps on the monster, wrapping his arms around its torso. He pushes the dog with all his might and plunges it into the swamp. The monster growls and tries to break free, but Mizuno holds on tight, with no intention of letting go. Since the protagonist can't tolerate the poison, he'll toss the monsters straight into the swamp. After the creature's eye was damaged, the monster lost its composure. It was very easy to hit the creature's eye because of its size, but now the monster's skill, called Enhanced Vision, is completely useless. The dog yelps, thrashing desperately in the swamp. Mizuno holds it tight. He clenches his teeth with all his might. The protagonist is determined to win and has no intention of giving up. He's at level 1, while the monstrous creature is at level 79. As soon as this one dies, the main character's level will rise significantly. Mizuno is holding the monster by the neck. It's growling deafeningly. The protagonist is already gasping for breath from exhaustion. He's about to use his knife. Even though there's a huge level difference between the protagonist and the monster, at a moment like this, even a weak weapon can deal serious damage. Mizuno draws his knife and stabs the monster in the eye, determined to finish it off. But to the protagonist's astonishment, the blade bounces off, leaving a crack. The protagonist realizes just how hard the eye is. The monster didn't like Mizuno's attack. It begins to struggle with renewed strength. It growls deafeningly. The protagonist winces. The dog is too powerful. The protagonist can't hold it back. The monster breaks free. Mizuno isn't about to let this slip away, though. And once again, he grabs hold of it. The dog strikes him with force and flings him aside. The protagonist is flung out of the swamp and falls onto the rocky ground. The blow knocks the wind out of him. The protagonist coughs convulsively. He coughs up blood. The system warns that Mizuno has 8 health points remaining out of 36. Trying to regain his composure, The protagonist notices with listless astonishment that the monstrous dog is still trying to pull itself out of the swamp. The protagonist didn't think the monster had that much strength left. Mizuno himself is in much worse shape. His body won't obey him at all. He can barely even move his fingers. Beads of sweat stream down the protagonist's face, and blood drips from his mouth, but all this effort is barely enough to move his hand slightly. The monster has no intention of giving up. With screeches and growls, it tries to break free from the deadly trap. Even while trapped in the poisonous swamp, the monster managed to fling the protagonist this far away. Mizuno desperately tries to force himself to move. He can't give up now. A clawed paw touches solid ground. With great effort, the monstrous dog pulls itself onto the floor and lets out a triumphant howl. The protagonist realizes with horror that his opponent has managed to escape. Mizuno's eyes widen when he sees saliva dripping from the creature's mouth. The monster stares directly at the protagonist. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist tries to at least crawl away. He needs to run. Every movement makes him gasp in pain. Tears of despair well up in his eyes. The protagonist knows he can't move, no matter how hard he tries. One question keeps spinning through his mind. Is he really going to die? The protagonist can only whisper that he doesn't want to die. He prays for salvation. Tears are already streaming down his face. Mizuno recalls how he begged Abadar to take him back to his world, and how Abadar had smirked in response. That thought makes the protagonist open his eyes wide. He knows that pleading won't change anything. The protagonist can rely only on himself and his own strength. He wiggles his fingers again, and, gasping from the effort, he moves his leg. Gritting his teeth in pain, he manages to lift himself up slightly. Gritting his teeth resolutely, Mizuno reminds himself that the weak cannot survive in this cruel world. Through sheer willpower, the protagonist forces himself to stand up. He has no intention of dying so easily. Mizuno spots his knife a short distance away. He walks over to it and picks it up. The protagonist vows to himself that he will definitely return home. The protagonist leaps into the air, raising the knife above the monster. The monster has already bared its jaws, revealing its sharp, large teeth. The protagonist has one and only one chance. He can't let his guard down. Mizuno chooses the perfect moment to attack. The monster may have incredibly thick skin that can even withstand poison, but a crack remained in its eye after the protagonist's strike. That's exactly where the protagonist aims. With a strong, decisive motion, Mizuno drives the knife into the creature's wounded eye. Pushing with all his might, the protagonist drives the blade and up to the hilt. The monster struggles to break free as best it can. It retreats back into the poisonous swamp. Mizuno gasps from the strain, but keeps pressing down on the knife. The monster doesn't give up, snarling in helpless rage. The protagonist shouts in anger that it's time for the dog to die. The surface of the eye gives way, and the protagonist runs the blade across it, slicing off the eye. The monster roars in pain. It breaks free, knocking Mizuno into a poisonous swamp. Mizuno doesn't lose his composure. He grips the knife even tighter, and with renewed force, he plunges it into the monster's eye. The protagonist knows that this will be the end of it. He presses down on the blade and plunges the creature's head into the poison. The upper part of the monster's skull is being corroded. For a moment, the body remains standing, but then it falls onto its side. Mizuno looks uncertainly at the monster's corpse. He still can't quite believe that the beast is dead. With a trembling voice, the protagonist says that he's done it. And then, shouting, he repeats that word. He really has won. The protagonist straightens up and exhales with relief. The monster's corpse remains floating in the swamp. The protagonist feels that his body is already at its limit and that it's time for him to make his way to shore. Suddenly, Mizuno's eyes widen in shock at a sudden pain. He falls onto the monster's body with a cry, and he clutches his heart, gasping and screaming in pain. The protagonist frantically tries to figure out what's happening to him. It feels as if his body is crumbling from the inside out. He screams in agony, burying his face in the defeated beast. Tears stream from the protagonist's eyes. Breathing heavily, the protagonist sits up slightly, leaning against the monster's corpse. He is surprised to find that the pain has disappeared. Glancing at his hands, Mizuno sees that they have grown larger. Glancing to the side, he notices that his hair has grown back. The protagonist summons a holographic window, and he sees that his level has risen to 36. Exhausted, the protagonist rejoices at the promotion. He's actually managed to pull off what he set out to do. Lifting up his shirt, Mizuno discovers that his body has also transformed with the level up. He now has a six-pack. The protagonist realizes that his level is now higher than that of most of Abadar's minions. The good news doesn't end there. A notification appears stating that for reaching level 30, the protagonist has earned the title Poison Warrior. Stunned, Mizuno eagerly reads the details. The enhanced ability increases the poison neutralization limit by 100% and grants the ability to create and release poison. Still clutching his side wearily, the protagonist recalls that Abater hadn't mentioned anything about skill upgrades. At the time, the man had merely noted that the alien had an interesting ability. The protagonist suspects that Abater himself doesn't know that skills can be developed. Suddenly, some sounds catch Mizuno's attention. Turning around, he sees a creature on the shore busily devouring the remains of another monster. The protagonist is too exhausted to engage in battle. The creature continues its meal, all the while keeping its eyes fixed on the protagonist. It seems to him that the monster is watching him. He happens to look up and discovers that other creatures are hovering above him. More carnivorous creatures, fellow scavengers, are perched around the swamp. Mizuno realizes he's surrounded. He wonders when all these monsters managed to arrive. He assumes they've been hiding in the shadows all this time and have now emerged to feast on the remains. A noise comes from the dark passageway, and another creature emerges from there. It's the Goblin Chieftain. He's on the 62nd level. The protagonist realizes that this is the leader of the Corpse Eaters. He regrets that the monster appeared right now. The protagonist sees that he has nowhere to run. He's terribly exhausted, and his stamina hasn't recovered since leveling up. And yet, Mizuno grits his teeth once more. He has no intention of giving up so quickly. The protagonist resolutely moves closer to the shore where the monsters, led by their leader, have gathered. Mizuno grabs his knife, swings his arm, and shouts that he's going to test his new skills on these creatures. He doesn't know what his new opponents are capable of, so it's crucial for him to remain vigilant right now. However, since the monsters aren't venturing into the swamp, that means they too fear this poison. Thanks to the increased neutralization limit, the protagonist now has more time to catch his breath. On top of that, he's gained new skills, poison creation and poison release. This is now Mizuno's main trump card in his battle against the monsters. He's also interested in absorbing the poison. When he tasted the poison last time, nothing bad happened. The protagonist decides to take advantage of the monster's caution. They haven't made a move yet. And to test how his new power works. The protagonist scoops up some poison, cups his hands together like a boat, and brings them to his lips, and takes a mouthful of poison. Mizuno flinches in surprise. Now the sensation is completely different from last time. The poison has a terribly pungent smell and a very bitter taste. The protagonist desperately wants to spit out the poison, but he forces himself to endure it. Meanwhile, the goblin leader approaches the two smaller monsters. With a satisfied grin, he grabs one of them. The protagonist covers his mouth with his hand. He thinks of his sister. Unable to resist, the protagonist swallows the poison. To his surprise, nothing happens, even though he definitely swallowed the poison. He looks up and sees a monster flying straight at his face, launched by the goblin leader. Instinctively, Mizuno throws his hands up, and with a scream, he swings them, sending a spray of poison flying. The monster is flung far backward, and slams it into a stone wall right before his comrade's eyes. Glancing toward the shore, the protagonist realizes that the Goblin Chieftain is ruthlessly using his own kind as projectiles. Noticing the snarl on the massive monster's snout, the protagonist realizes he was too cocky. He looks down at his empty hands and can't find his knife. Mizuno frantically searches the swamp for his weapon. The blade must be somewhere nearby. The knife is found above the protagonist's head. It is stuck in a rocky outcrop. Just then, a deafening roar from the goblin leader echoes from the shore. Mizuno turns around, unsure of what the monsters are up to. The creatures are running along the shore. And then, to the protagonist's astonishment, they rush straight into the poison. The protagonist notes with horror that they are willingly running to their deaths. With their bodies, the creatures form something like a ring that tightens around Mizuno. He watches them in bewilderment, trying to figure out what they're up to. At that moment, another monster pushes off on the ground. It soars into the air while the protagonist stares at it in shock. The monster lands with a screech on the bodies of its fellow creatures, sending up a cloud of spray. The protagonist realizes that the creature plans to use the other monsters as a bridge to reach him. Watching the creatures leap over the corpses of their comrades, Mizuno wonders, do these monsters really not care at all about their own lives? With every leap, the monsters get closer to their target. The protagonist frantically tries to come up with a plan, realizing that at this rate, the monsters are about to reach him. Here come the first three creatures, charging straight at Mizuno. But for some reason, they're moving as if in slow motion, and the protagonist manages to dodge them. The creatures fall into the poison with a hiss. The protagonist faces the next wave of attackers in a daze. For some reason, their movements seem terribly slow to him. Mizuno assumes this is due to his level increase. Just then, a notification appears, informing him that he has absorbed the dungeon's deadly poison. The protagonist's eyes widen. Turning to face his enemies and raising his hand, he casts a poison spell. Mizuno's palm is covered in a glowing liquid. He looks indifferently at the monster flying straight toward him and roaring. The protagonist wants to finally calm down the creature. Now he can see all the monster's attacks and time his strike perfectly. With a swift motion, Mizuno strikes the monster right in the face. The poison from the protagonist's palm dissolves the creature's face, and the goblin falls into the swamp with a plaintive squeal. The protagonist realizes with relief that he succeeded. But it's too early to relax. Another group of monsters is on the way. Mizuno throws the living projectiles aside. The monsters let out bewildered screams, plunge into the poison, sending up a spray of water. The protagonist drowns the monsters, who are howling desperately in pain, burning them with his own hands. The protagonist frowns resolutely, convincing himself that he can handle it. After dispatching the smaller creatures, Mizuno straightens up and locks eyes with his main problem. The monster leader, still baring its fangs, stares at the young man. The protagonist understands perfectly well that the large goblin is simply toying with him, not considering him a threat at all. The protagonist knows that the moment he gets close, the leader will attack him in an instant. Mizuno has no long-range attacks. That means he needs to come up with a plan. Just then, something falls from the ceiling, and with a loud splash, it lands in the swamp right behind the protagonist. He flinches. He turns around. To his surprise, he sees a rock. Next to it lies the protagonist's knife. The guy looks up, trying to figure out where it fell from. That's when Mizuno notices something new. The stone is melting. A flash of insight strikes the protagonist, and he looks down at the swamp, where the poison is corroding the fallen shard. The protagonist realizes that the poison is capable of dissolving even stones. Mizuno knows this is his chance, and that he must seize the opportunity that has presented itself. He looks toward the shore, where the goblin leader is watching him intently. The protagonist reminds himself that he is level 36 and is now much stronger. The protagonist comes up with a plan and hopes he can pull off. He folds his hands and imagines releasing poison from his fingertips. Clutching one palm firmly with the other, Mizuno casts the poison spell. The liquid once again envelopes his hands. The protagonist points his fingers at the goblin leader. Concentrating, the protagonist increases the amount of poison on his palms. He concentrates all the liquid at the very tips of his fingers, and then he releases the burst, aiming at a rock on the ceiling. He manages to chip off a piece, which falls into the swamp with a loud splash. Gritting his teeth in a tense snarl, the goblin leader grabs yet another of his kin, and he raises his paw, preparing to hurl him through the air. Seeing all this, the protagonist forces himself to produce more and more poison, knowing he needs the maximum charge. His fingers are covered in acid. The protagonist concentrates with all his might, verbalizing each of his actions. Seizing the moment, Mizuno lets out a scream and releases the poison. With a fixed snarl on its face, the monster leader stares at the lump of poison flying toward him, and he ducks, dodging the attack. Having successfully dodged the attack, he straightens up again, glancing at the protagonist with a hint of mockery. The protagonist wonders, does the monster really think that by dodging, the attack is over? Mizuno explains that he wasn't aiming at the leader at all. Just then, something drips onto the main monster's face. It's a stone melting under the effect of the poison. The goblin leader jerks his head up, but it's too late. A huge chunk breaks off from the ceiling and buries the monster beneath it, leaving it unable to move. Only the monster's head, with its mouth wide open, sticks out from under the rock. It continues to drip from the ceiling. Mizuno notices that the goblin leader hasn't even flinched. This turn of events suits the protagonist perfectly. He approaches the monster, which stares at him with a blank expression. The protagonist mockingly thanks the goblin for not taking him seriously. The protagonist steps out of the swamp and sits down next to the monster. The usual snarl has vanished from the goblin leader's face, replaced by a look of alarm. The protagonist asks the monster not to take offense. He then informs the creature that it will now serve as a test subject for him. Standing up and summoning the poison once more, Mizuno holds his hand directly over the leader's snout. The poisonous liquid drips from his fingers and drips straight into the monster's eye. The poison corrodes the monster's snout. The protagonist grits his teeth. A notification appears, stating that the protagonist's level has increased from 36 to 67. A familiar sensation pierces the young man's body. He stares at his hands in shock. He takes a step, but, breathing heavily, he collapses to the floor. Mizuno's strength completely abandons him. Lifting himself slightly off the floor, the protagonist notices the remains of one of the monsters in front of him. The protagonist knows he must return home. He's willing to do anything to survive. Gritting his teeth, Mizuno crawls with great effort toward the monster's remains. He sinks his teeth into the flesh, biting off a small piece of stringy meat. After eating a little, the protagonist notices a small puddle that has dripped from a melting rock on the ceiling. He creeps toward it, clutching the remaining flesh in his hands, and, lowering his head, drinks the liquid. Mizuno starts coughing. After catching his breath, he resumes eating. Only now does the exhausted protagonist realize that his level has become no lower than a Abadar's. The protagonist mentally appeals to Kana, asking the girl to wait just a little longer, and her brother will return to her. The young man's head drops, and Mizuno collapses exhausted onto the floor, sinking into a deep slumber right in the middle of the dungeon. Meanwhile, in a luxurious mansion, Abadar listens to his servant's report. He realizes the servant is talking about the guards and that weak foreigner. The servant reports that they still haven't returned. Abadar couldn't care less. He believes it's only a matter of time. Right now, he's more interested in the two beauties seated on either side of his throne. Abadar declares that he never had any hopes for that first-level guy anyway. He takes one of the girls by the chin, and she purrs softly with pleasure. Abadar only regrets having missed the spectacle of the foreigner's demise. Meanwhile, deep underground, the monster finishes its bloody feast on the remains of other monsters. All that's left of the feast is a goblin's head. The monster lifts its head. A piece of flesh hangs from its mouth. This creature is none other than Hikato, who resides on the 117th level. Mizuno slowly comes to. Rubbing his eyes with his hand, he realizes he had lost consciousness and wonders how long he'd been lying there. The protagonist sits down. A notification appears before his eyes. It warns that an uncollected item has been detected. Confused, the protagonist rereads the text, not understanding what it means. The only thing that fits the definition of item is the goblin chieftain. Deciding that the monster's remains must be what was meant, Mizuno gets to his feet. He approaches the pile of rocks that has become the monster's grave. Crouching down, he looks in surprise at what he finds near the pile. The protagonist picks up an object, assuming it's a rock. A new notification confirms that he has found exactly the item mentioned earlier. Still holding the mysterious object, the protagonist decides to read its description. It turns out that Mizuno's find is called a scleroplasmic potion. As the description explains, consuming this extremely toxic item grants a new skill. The protagonist examines the stone with great interest. He never would have thought he could get something like this from Monster. The protagonist decides to use the stone. After all, with his poison resistance, he certainly has nothing to fear. Squinting and not giving himself a chance to change his mind, Mizuno bites into the crystal bloodstone and swallows it. It instantly forms a lump in the middle of his throat. The protagonist notes that the stone's taste is strikingly different from that of the swamp poison. A new notification states that the protagonist has been exposed to a deadly poison. He already knows this full well, so he receives the notification with a touch of irritation. However, a new message appears immediately. The deadly poison has been neutralized. Mizuno doubles over, gasping. He covers his mouth with his hands and breathes heavily, but his suffering is rewarded. The protagonist gains a new skill called Harden. This message delights the protagonist. The only thing is he doesn't yet understand how to activate the ability. Mizuno says the name of the skill aloud, not quite confidently. The protagonist's hands are covered in a crystalline shell. The protagonist gasps in awe. He examines his hands. He notices that they now seem to be encased in armor. He already likes the skill. However, the effect doesn't last long. The coating begins to slip off. Mizuno does the math and realizes that the skill lasts about 30 seconds. Even with this limitation, he thinks this ability is very useful. With a tentative smile, the protagonist thinks that things are going just great for him. His level is now even higher than Abadar's. If the man refuses to send the protagonist home, he'll easily defeat him in battle. With these thoughts, Mizuno breaks into a broad smile, but it quickly fades from his face. The protagonist believes there's no need to rush. Even though this world may seem like a game, it's absolutely real. Of course, the protagonist level is currently higher than Abadar's, but Abadar has many allies and a vast army. That makes the battle pointless. What's the point of defeating Abadar if Mizuno can't fend off the soldiers afterward? The protagonist decides that he needs to prepare properly first. First and foremost, he needs to level up, and he also needs to get some good weapons. The protagonist thoughtfully pulls out his knife. He has no idea where to find a new weapon. Then his eyes light up. Since such a good item dropped from the Goblin Chieftain, there must be something useful left behind by other monsters as well. Frowning, the protagonist realizes that his next target is Hikato. Meanwhile, a commotion breaks out in the cave. A small monster is trying with all its might to escape. However, a long tongue wraps around its hind paw, and the little creature falls onto its side. It screams desperately as it is dragged toward its pursuer. Hikato pulls its prey into its mouth. The little monster is still trying to fight back, but it's all in vain. Hikato snaps its jaws shut, satisfied with the hunt. The monster leaps around the cave and suddenly stops. It sees the main character standing before it. The protagonist says he's been waiting for Hikato. The monster turns around and leaps in the other direction, demanding that the monstrous frog stop ignoring him. The main character picks up a rock from the floor. He hurls it at Hikato. It jumps sharply to the side and quickly shoots out its tongue. The protagonist flinches. He didn't expect the monster to go on the offensive right away. Mizuno barely manages to dodge the deadly tongue. The monstrous frog hits the stone wall instead of the guy, sending a hail of shards flying. Cursing, the protagonist manages to jump out of the way at the last moment to avoid being hit by the falling rocks. Hikato soars up to the very ceiling and crashes into the cave's vaulted ceiling. Pushing off from it, it lands with a thud right in front of the protagonist. Mizuno realizes there's no way he can reach the monster if it keeps moving at that speed. The guy needs to figure out a way to slow the monster down. Upon taking a closer look at Hikato, Mizuno realizes that its speed depends on its legs. He watches intently as the monstrous frog extends its limb, and it leaps to the side. If the protagonist manages to predict where the monster will jump, it won't be able to escape. The protagonist crosses his fingers. As it turns out, for good reason. Hikato suddenly shoots its tongue at him. Mizuno is momentarily flustered. He manages to hold his hands out in front of him and activate his shield. The monster's attack ends, and the protagonist checks and sees that the tongue failed to pierce his armor. This means the protagonist has a chance to defend himself against Hikato's attack. Mizuno notices that the monstrous frog is about to jump. Hikato pushes off the ground, and the protagonist rapidly interlocks his fingers. He uses poison creation. He fires a blast straight into Hikato's face. The poison floods the monster frog's head. The monster rises onto its legs. It leaps closer to the protagonist, making strange noises the whole time. The monster transforms, taking on its second form. A tongue pokes out of its toothy maw. The protagonist doesn't hesitate for a second. Drawing his knife, he uses the poison creation skill. Hikato prepares to attack, but the protagonist activates shield. Without wasting a precious moment, Mizuno swiftly plunges his blade into the monster's eye. Blood spurted from the monster's wound. The enraged creature lunges at the protagonist, but he was prepared for this turn of events. He holds out his armored hand in front of him, and a monstrous frog swallows it whole. The protagonist remarks mockingly that it won't be able to devour him. The monster's teeth clamp down on his protected arm, causing Mizuno not the slightest harm. The protagonist activates poison creation once more, and then shield. Something resembling a crystalline tip appears on his fingers. The protagonist bids farewell to Hikato, and he plunges his weapon in, piercing the monster right through. Deprived of its eyes and nose, with blood spurting from its wounds. With its mouth wide open, the monstrous frog's body collapses to the floor. A message pops up in front of the protagonist stating that his level has been raised from 67 to 92. The protagonist finds this hard to believe. Smiling, he rejoices at such a high level. A reminder about an uncollected item pops up. Now Mizuno remembers why he even started this fight in the first place. The protagonist approaches the body of his defeated enemy. Something glimmers among the remains. A hilt pierces through the flesh. The protagonist realizes, stunned, that he is looking at a sword. However, a strange feeling comes over him. Still, Mizuno is about to pick up the item that fell out of Hikato. He grabs the hilt. A description of the sword appears. This weapon is called the Cursed Blade of Anra. Even a minor scratch from its poisonous blade will lead to death. Stunned, the protagonist pulls the blade from the monster's remains. He brings the sharp blade to his finger and is about to make a cut. Suddenly, the protagonist feels as if he's been tossed into the air, forcing him to abandon the experiment. He looks around hurriedly. Mizuno sensé a truly terrifying aura, and he realizes that something is bearing down on him. A huge, clawed paw steps onto the rock. Its owner wonders, could it be that Hikato has been defeated by some pathetic little human? The protagonist stares wide-eyed at the new monster. The monster, meanwhile, wonders what this human tastes like. Beelzebub appears before the protagonist. He is at level 140 and possesses several skills. Poison resistance, strong, demonic poison, scent of presence, and gluttony. Night falls. A dinner is being held at Abadur's residence. The host himself and his companions are seated at the head of a huge table. The guards stand opposite them. Abadur asks, have the people sent into the dungeon still not returned? One of the guards nods, adding that they have been unable to contact those who left. Abadur asks why he's only being told this now. One of his female companions is feeding him with a fork, so he speaks and pauses. The guard apologize in trembling voices, but Abadur waves them off. He considers the people's disappearance a trifle and suggests they forget about it. The guards thank him with relief. A huge table is groaning under the weight of all kinds of food. A girl wipes Abadar's lips with a napkin. For a moment, the man recalls how Mizuno had begged to return home. Smiling, he decides that the people sent to the dungeon are surely already dead. The guards note in bewilderment that the soldiers who went there were at least level 30. Abadar explains that the dungeon is inhabited by monsters with levels no lower than 50. He adds that the kingdom assigns positions to the nobility that match their strength and laughs briefly. Even his beautiful companions are a loss. The man bursts into deafening laughter. The guards stare at him in horror. Tugging at his beard, Abadar considers assembling a special cleanup squad. They'll be able to level up quite a bit. Waving his arms, the man announces that treasures never before seen are hidden in that dungeon. However, before setting out, Abadar wants to gain a little experience, which he announces with a sinister smirk on his lips. He rises from the table and approaches the bewildered guard. In an instant, Abadar incinerates the soldier, still smiling. The rest of those present freeze in horror. Someone finds the strength to ask, "What is Abadar doing?" He replies that he won't forget the others either. With a single wave of his hand, he directs the fire at the crowd. The people scream in agony as they burn alive. Abadar stands in the middle of the now empty hall. All that remains of the people is ash and smoldering embers. Turning around, Abadar orders the butler to clean up, and the butler obediently agrees. With a satisfied smirk, the mansion's owner watches as his level rises from 51 to 60. Abadar is instantly surrounded by his lovely companions, who congratulate and praise him. Smiling contentedly and accepting a kiss, the man decides it's now time to go monster hunting. Meanwhile, the protagonist freezes helplessly in front of Beelzebub. The fly-like monster's stats terrify the protagonist, especially its level 140. Mizuno fully understands that Beelzebub is much stronger than Hikato, whom he had fought before. On top of that, the monster can speak human language. Beelzebub is glad he flew to this very spot. It hasn't feasted on human flesh in quite some time. A long tentacle shoots toward the protagonist at tremendous speed. Mizuno hurriedly activates the shield. The tentacle's blow knocks the protagonist off his feet. He hits the floor and immediately rushes to check his armor. The protagonist is horrified to see that the monster has managed to pierce the shield. Beelzebub retracts its tentacle and takes flight. He finds his opponent's behavior amusing and the protagonist himself intriguing. Mizuno jumps to his feet. He needs to run. Beelzebub wonders where the man is headed. Without slowing down, the protagonist grabs his knife from the floor. He knows that a single blow from the monster will be the end of him. Beelzebub has already managed to pierce the veil, even though it was just a routine attack from the monster. Yes, the protagonist has fought monsters before and prevailed thanks to his skills. But the problem is that Beelzebub has high resistance to poisons. The monster watches intently as its fleeing prey runs away. He grabs onto a rocky ledge as he runs. The protagonist dives behind it and hides. Breathing heavily, he cautiously peeks out. To his surprise, Beelzebub is nowhere to be seen. The cave seems empty. The protagonist doesn't understand where the monster that was just chasing him is gone. Mizuno seriously doubts that he managed to escape his pursuer and begins to wonder what he should do now. In the past, the protagonist could rely only on his own skills, but now he has the hammer blade. As he examines the sword, the protagonist surmises that if he makes use of its power, he'll be able to defeat the fly-like monster. At that moment, Beelzebub appears behind Mizuno. The monster asks if the man is playing games with him. The protagonist's eyes glaze over with fear. The protagonist falls onto his back, crawling away from the monster. One of Beelzebub's skills, gluttony, flashes through his mind. Mizuno realizes he has no choice but to use his sword. He hopes the weapon won't let him down. The protagonist shouts the blade's name and swings it. As he leaps, Mizuno strikes the monster's body with the blade. Staring in confusion at the blade, which has come to a halt at the monster's torso, the protagonist thinks he hasn't managed to pierce the monster's skin. However, that's not the problem. One tentacle is holding the protagonist's hand, and the others are already charging toward him. Keeping his cool, Mizuno activates poison creation. Then he activates shield, creating a sort of protective barrier. This shields him from the tentacles, which only knock him off his feet. But Beelzebub doesn't stop. Before the protagonist has a chance to get back up, the tentacles are already charging again. The protagonist manages to roll out of the way, dodging the blows. The force of the attack is so great that the tentacles chip away at the floor when they strike it. Still lying on his back, Mizuno releases a burst of poison. He sends it toward the ceiling. The resulting shard is supposed to fall directly onto Beelzebub. However, the monster smashes it into several pieces with a single blow of its tentacle. The monster is confident that the protagonist won't be able to escape it. It has no intention of letting its prey go. The protagonist crawls backward until his back is pressed against a ledge. He realizes that all his attacks are completely useless. On top of that, the protagonist is constantly overcome by a strange feeling. He tries to figure out where it came from. Mizuno recalls how he found his knife, and a realization hits him. Because of Beelzebub's presence detection ability, it will easily figure out where he's hiding, which means the protagonist can't stop moving. The protagonist jumps to his feet and immediately freezes upon seeing something. A whole swarm of tiny flies is buzzing around him. Not understanding where the insects came from, Mizuno looks up information about them. These creatures are mini Beelzebubs. They are on the 80th level and possess the skills resistance to poison, weak, and poison attack. Beelzebub triumphantly announces that he has found the main character. The monster opens its mouth, and more mini Beelzebubs fly out. They immediately rush toward the protagonist. He draws his blade from its sheath. First, he activates Poison Creation. Then he activates Shield. The sword becomes covered in crystals. Noticing this, Mizuno prepares to attack. The mini Beelzebubs are fast, of course, but not so fast that the protagonist can't keep track of them. The protagonist spins in place, striking with his weapon. He manages to cut the mini Beelzebub in half. That's enough for someone of his level. The next group of monsters flies toward Mizuno, but he manages to fend them off again. The mini Beelzebub's resistance isn't as strong as that of the large fly-like monster. If the protagonist continues to spread the poison, he won't have any trouble with the small creatures. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierces the protagonist. Turning around, he sees that one of the mini Beelzebubs has sunk its fangs into his shoulder. A swing of the sword, and several more attacking monsters, including the one that bit him, are killed. Mizuno resolutely pulls out the fangs as he stares at his enemies. They shouldn't count on the protagonist giving up easily. He intends to kill all these damn insects. After all, the protagonist has an extremely important reason to return home. Countless mini Beelzebubs have been cut down. A whole mountain of corpses lies at the feet of a heavily breathing Mizuno. At that moment, a pair of tentacles is already flying toward him. The protagonist barely has time to notice the danger, and he jumps out of the way. He's only recently leveled up and isn't used to his new powers yet. Because of this, the protagonist is flung all the way up to the ceiling. He flies straight toward the tentacles. Beelzebub watches Mizuno fall intently, and he notices that he's entertaining. The monster asks him to entertain him some more. The protagonist watches in horror as he's about to be caught in a trap of tentacles. But the protagonist manages to brace himself and find a foothold. With a decisive move, he slashes through the tentacles, though all that remains is a cut. Mizuno falls backward onto the stone floor. The impact knocks the wind out of his lungs. Beelzebub is delighted and suggests they continue. The protagonist sits up and looks at the cut in disappointment. It seems the blade's poison hasn't taken effect. The protagonist breathes heavily, silently cursing the monster. If their battle continues, the protagonist will be completely drained of strength. Beelzebub grins savagely. Mizuno doesn't know how to defeat this monster. He decides to try using more poison. An idea pops into his head, though the protagonist isn't sure if it will work. Activating his ability, the protagonist covers his fingertips with tips. When the poison enters Beelzebub's body, it begins to spread. Suddenly, the monster falls onto its back, its claws curling up, and they reach toward its belly. Mizuno watches the scene unfold with eyes full of horror. Beelzebub rips open its belly with its claws. 3 spots protrude from a wound. The monster now resembles a giant spider. The protagonist stares in shock at the transformed monster. He no longer understands what kind of creature this is. Beelzebub's tentacles twitch, and they strike the stone pillars with great force. The protagonist ducks, barely managing to stay on his feet. He looks up. He sees that the monster has destroyed a stone pillar with a single attack. Right before Mizuno's eyes, Beelzebub devours the shards. Now the protagonist understands what the gluttony skill is. Suddenly, beads of sweat run down the protagonist's face. He breathes heavily, his mouth agape. Mizuno feels sick. He collapses. His fingers tremble and clutch frantically at the stone floor. The protagonist realizes that his wound is truly serious. He's lying on his stomach. Beelzebub looms over the protagonist. The protagonist notes that Mizuno held his own pretty well. But the protagonist doesn't give up. Overcoming the pain, he reaches out his hand. The tentacles are already almost touching the protagonist's back. Mizuno's fingers are almost touching the object he spotted. But at that moment, Beelzebub swells to unprecedented proportions. The ground gives way beneath the protagonist's feet. The monster hangs over the chasm. Tentacles dangle from its torso, and slime trickles down its belly, exposing its ribs. The protagonist is falling into the void along with fragments of rock. Mizuno's strength completely abandons him. He feels as though he's about to lose consciousness. His eyes roll back, his eyelids close, his fingers unclench helplessly. The protagonist's level rises from 92 to 102. A cord descends from somewhere above. It wraps around the protagonist's wrist. A blade hangs from the other end of the rope. The protagonist's eyes fly open. He comes to and sees Beelzebub looming over him and strikes the monster's body with all his might. The protagonist manages to get back on his feet. The monster notices that Mizuno is still struggling. The protagonist is breathing heavily, clutching the blade tightly. He checks his status and discovers that his level has gone up. Mizuno realizes this happened because he defeated the mini Beelzebub. A strange sensation catches the protagonist's attention. He discovers a cord wrapped around his arm and the blade. The protagonist doesn't quite understand what it is, but realizes he can use the blade. Mizuno looks up. Just in time, Beelzebub's tentacles have already begun to move. The protagonist runs away, but the tentacles follow him. When they encounter an obstacle, a stone pillar, they simply smash it to pieces. On top of the shards, Beelzebub releases a swarm of flies. The tentacles don't stop either. The protagonist jumps upward and hangs unnoticed beneath the stone arch. He waits for the moment when Beelzebub is directly beneath him. The monster says that Mizuno radiates such a thirst for blood that he can be detected even without using a skill. However, the protagonist strikes with his blade. To Beelzebub's astonishment, a wound remains on the tentacle. The monster realizes what kind of weapon the protagonist is wielding. The protagonist feels the poison spreading rapidly through his body. The next strike splits the tentacle in two. Beelzebub's claws curl up, but the monster declares that such a wound is not enough. However, he is mistaken. His limbs no longer obey him. Beelzebub sees that the poison is corroding even a stone pillar. Drops of blood fall to the ground. The monster looks up and, seeing Mizuno, asks what he has done. Mizuno is breathing heavily, holding his hand out in front of him. The protagonist used a special poison. Once it enters the body, it causes paralysis of the limbs. After this, Beelzebub will no longer be able to move so quickly. But the monster immediately declares that even though he'll experience some minor inconveniences, it's no big deal. Beelzebub believes that the protagonist has simply been lucky all this time, since he's been relying on his surroundings and various tricks. However, Mizuno is still nothing compared to the monster's level of power. Noticing the protagonist's expression, Beelzebub asks him not to make such a face, since it's too early to give up hope. The protagonist has no intention of listening to any of this, and simply charges into the attack. Immediately, Mizuno, cursing under his breath, sees that the monster has forcibly opened its gluttonous maw. But the protagonist decides to ignore it and cut off the enemy's head. Beelzebub yells at the protagonist that he's finished, and releases a swarm of flies. Gritting his teeth, Mizuno blocks the blade, preparing to face a group of monsters. But then, Beelzebub himself destroys the swarm of flies, splattering blood across the bewildered protagonist's face. He doesn't understand why the monster destroyed its own creations. It's highly unlikely that Beelzebub missed, so this is just too strange. The protagonist activates the poison creation skill, and he directs the resulting projectile at the monster. But then a tentacle knocks the protagonist off balance. Mizuno wonders if Beelzebub deliberately aimed not at him, but at its own creations. The protagonist notices blood on the monster's tentacles, and he recalls the creature's abilities. The protagonist activates poison creation. Mizuno realized that the poison had damaged the monster's senses, and now the creature was practically blind. This explains why Beelzebub was striking its own creatures. It's simply attacking at random. But then the protagonist is shocked to notice that not a single fly remains. Beelzebub declares that he knows what the protagonist is about to do. It asks, what will Mizuno do now? Breathing heavily, the protagonist charges at the monster with his blade raised. He contemptuously calls the guy a fool. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist raises his weapon. Beelzebub moves his tentacles. He shouts that Mizuno is about to die. But suddenly, the tentacles stop obeying their master. The stunned monster realizes that his body has been paralyzed. It tries to figure out where the protagonist is by tracking his magical power. Beelzebub triumphantly discovers something, and with his last ounce of strength, he strikes in that direction. But suddenly, the protagonist's poisonous projectiles intercept it. They strike the monster's body, and Mizuno races up its tentacle. Beelzebub still tries to resist somehow, but, as the protagonist declares, it's already too late. The protagonist delivers the final blow with his sword. Meanwhile, in front of a beautiful mansion, three men wait with bored expressions on their faces. Suddenly, they see a botter riding up on horseback. He is the one the trio has been waiting for. Abadar rides up to the men and thanks them for gathering so quickly. They rise from their seats, smiling. The man wearing the skull of some creature on his head is Aaron Banley. He is at level 32. His long-haired companion is Burbelt Reno. He is at level 30. Finally, the third man, with short hair and a scar on his cheek, is Myrtle Mullen. He has the highest level of the three, level 37. Moreover, Myrtle possesses the storm skill. Abadar is quite satisfied with his companions. Then again, he didn't expect anything less from these men. However, as Abadar notes, there's still one person missing. No sooner has he finished speaking than the latecomer appears. The last to arrive senses that something interesting is brewing, and he asks, could it be that the Baron wishes to start a war? The young man walks confidently toward the group, leading his horse behind him. The young man announces that he has returned. Myrtle calls out to the young man. Burbelt admits that he didn't expect the young man to come. Abadar greets the newcomer. The young man reports that he has heard the men are planning to visit the dungeon. Abadar replies that nothing can be hidden from the Order's deputy commander, Owen. The young man's eyes widen in surprise when he sees that the man has leveled up. Abadar notes that Owen hasn't been wasting any time either, and he's even managed to get his hands on a new weapon. Owen proudly shows off his blade, casually explaining that it dropped from some pesky lizard, which of course was actually a monster. With a cruel smile, Owen hopes that this time he'll manage to find someone in the dungeon who can entertain him. He adds dreamily that he loves the crunch of breaking bones. Abadar promises he won't disappoint the deputy commander. The squad sets out for the dungeon. Meanwhile, the massive body of the fallen Beelzebub lies in the cave. The protagonist stands before the corpse, looking tiny in comparison. Mizuno frowns. A notification appears stating that his level has gone up. The protagonist slowly makes his way through the cave. Approaching a crystal pillar, the protagonist glances at his reflection. He realizes with confusion that he has changed drastically and no longer resembles his former self. There's still one more thing he needs to do. Mizuno promises that he'll be back with his sister very soon. With a grim smile, the protagonist notes that now he'll finally be able to talk to Abadar. The protagonist walks past the corpse of Beelzebub. A notification pops up, informing him that he has received a new item. The protagonist looks around. He almost missed the new item. Mizuno is holding a vial of potion in his hand. This item is an elixir, a miraculous remedy capable of curing any injury or illness. The protagonist is stunned by what he's read. He realizes that a true treasure has fallen into his hands. With this elixir, Kana will finally be able to recover. But then Mizuno notices that the notification about the new item hasn't gone away. He realizes he hasn't found everything yet. No matter how hard the protagonist looks, he sees nothing. All that's left is to check Beelzebub's mouth. Something glitters in the monster's mouth. Leaning in, the protagonist peeks into the monster's mouth. His eyes widen when he finally sees the object. Suddenly, the entire cave seems to start shaking. Looking up in confusion, Mizuno assumes an earthquake has started. He realizes the cave is about to collapse. A new notification pops up in front of the protagonist's face. It states that the dungeon boss has been defeated, and now this location is disappearing. A piercing scream rings out behind the protagonist. Turning around, he sees a toothy creature trying to squeeze through a narrow passage. A huge rock falls from the ceiling, crushing the monster's head. The protagonist realizes that the dungeon boss was Beelzebub. He understands that he needs to leave this place immediately. Breathing heavily, Mizuno rushes toward the light at the end of the tunnel, that is, toward the exit. Meanwhile, the squad is riding toward the dungeon. Turning around, Abadar announces with satisfaction that they have arrived at their destination. Before them lies the dark entrance to the cave. While everyone dismounts, Abadar informs them that the sweep will begin right from here, adding that he is counting on the strength of his companions. He gives them permission to kill any monsters, saying he won't object. The only thing Abadar asks is that they not go too deep. With a smile, he announces that they can begin. At that very moment, the entire dungeon shakes. Stumbling over her words, Myrtle asks, "What's happening?" Right before the party's eyes, rocks begin falling from the dungeon's ceiling. Owen has already figured out the cause of the earthquake. Stunned, Abadar stares blankly at the cave. He realizes that the dungeon is collapsing, which means someone has killed the boss. Abadar angrily wonders who dared to do this. Owen calls out to the man, warning him that someone is approaching. A silhouette is visible amid the cloud of dust. With a sigh, Mizuno steps out of the cave, his sword held aloft. The protagonist shields his eyes from the unusually blinding sun. After his eyes adjust to the light a little, he lowers his hand and takes a step forward. Only now does the protagonist see the squad in front of him. Stunned, Mizuno freezes. Among the men, he recognizes Abadar. Myrtle is the first to snap out of it. He calls the protagonist a brazen fool. Abadar waves his fingers in confusion. Myrtle presses Mizuno, demanding that he explain what he's done. He asks what the protagonist has done, but the protagonist remains silent, staring ahead in shock. Myrtle shouts rudely that he's actually talking to the protagonist and asks if he's deaf or something. Mizuno comes to his senses and asks Abada in confusion, "Don't you remember me?" The man looks back at him questioningly. Owen notes that, judging by his clothes, the protagonist is a slave and adds that it's still unclear how the guy ended up in this place. Enraged, Abada concludes that since some servant managed to defeat the boss, the dungeon must have actually been filled with low-level monsters. In a fit of rage, the man orders the protagonist to be killed. Myrtle eagerly reaches for her sword. He hurriedly approaches the protagonist, who stands motionless. Smirking, Myrtle declares that Mizuno is out of luck, and that he would have been better off dying in the dungeon. He swings his blade. Abada is already saddling his horse when he feels someone's gaze on him. Turning around, he sees the protagonist staring intently at him. Abada is taken aback. Mizuno doesn't even pay attention to Myrtle, who is attacking him. The man swings his sword, and to the astonishment of his companions and himself, he is unable to strike. The protagonist stops the blade with his bare hand. Myrtle only has time to snort in bewilderment. In the next instant, Mizuno decapitates the man with his own weapon. Owen and Abada are stunned by the execution of their companion. The protagonist simply stands over the corpse. Then Burbelt joins the fight. He moves at tremendous speed, circling around Mizuno. Burbelt is certain that the foolish Myrtle simply let his guard down and paid for it with his life. Myrtle is confident that, given his speed, the protagonist won't even have time to notice him. However, he is mistaken. The protagonist notices Burbelt's movement, dodges it, and thus confuses his opponent, and immediately attacks. After defeating his opponent, Mizuno leaps into the air. It's Aaron's turn to join the fight. The protagonist lunges at him with his bare hands. Aaron, enraged, demands that such a nobody not dare to get cocky. He swings his club, and the protagonist punches it. The weapon snaps in half. Aaron can't believe that Mizuno broke the club with his bare hands. But the man has no time to think further. The protagonist, still using his fist, strikes his opponent in the chest. All the air is knocked out of Aaron's lungs. Mizuno lifts his defeated enemy with one hand. Then he throws the body to the ground. A sudden movement catches the protagonist's attention. Turning around, he manages to dodge a striking blow from Owen, who had appeared behind Mizuno. Owen is impressed. Smiling, he remarks that the protagonist seems to be an unusual slave. Owen tries to strike again and again, but Mizuno tirelessly dodges. Owen is already fired up. With his hair standing on end, he demands that the protagonist stop dodging already. But the protagonist dodges the blow once more. Owen pauses thoughtfully. Ruffling his hair, he cheerfully remarks that Mizuno moves pretty well. Owen adds that the protagonist, of course, still has a long way to go before he can match him. He recalls that the protagonist wanted something from Abada and asks what exactly it was. He clarifies that he's asking purely out of curiosity. Not getting an answer, Owen isn't particularly upset, declaring that Mizuno is going to die anyway. Electric discharges course through the deputy commander's chest, and then bolts of lightning burst forth. Owen is at level 50. He possesses the skills Lightning Strike and Dragon's Fawn. Noticing Owen's frenzied gaze, Abada snorts. Lightning shoots from Owen's eyes, and a sphere appears before him, crackling with electrical discharges. He shouts that he'll see how Mizuno manages to dodge this time. Owen releases the bolt. The protagonist calmly watches the approaching lightning. Then, with a swing of his blade, he parries the attack. The electricity is diverted into a tree. The protagonist lowers his weapon. Abada and Owen stare at Mizuno in shock. Owen frowns in confusion, unable to understand how the protagonist managed to parry his skill. He decides to check the protagonist's status. What he sees shocks Owen. Mizuno is at level 117 and has 3 skills: Poison Warrior, Lord of Poisons, and Shield. Owen can't figure out who the main character really is. He stands calmly, staring intently at his enemy. But aside from main character's level and skills, something else strikes Owen as remarkable. Mizuno holds the title Lord of the Flies. The protagonist briefly asks if Owen has calmed down. He adds that Owen has no chance of winning and orders him to get out of the way. Lightning flashes from Owen's eyes. He screams furiously, warning the protagonist not to dare underestimate him. Owen draws his sword, but Mizuno shatters his weapon with a single blow. The protagonist says curtly that Owen is driving him crazy. He swings again. Owen realizes what's about to happen. He doesn't want to die, but it's too late. The blade grazes the deputy commander's skin. Owen cries out, tears stream from his eyes, and foam comes out of his mouth. He has wet himself and can no longer control his body. Owen falls to the ground. Mizuno stares at him coldly. Abada is stunned by the protagonist's power. He tries to figure out who the protagonist really is. The protagonist calls out to Abadar. The man looks up, meeting the young man's gaze. Mizuno asks if Abadar has forgotten his promise, and in an icy voice, he orders him to return him to his world. Mizuno, his blade drawn, stands impassively over the unconscious Owen, his gaze fixed intently on Abadar. The protagonist takes a step forward. Abadar notes to himself that the protagonist is an interesting young man. He smirks and snorts. The man calmly admits that he underestimated Mizuno. He notes to himself that even Owen, now lying unconscious off to the side, was no match for him. The protagonist remains standing, not even flinching, glaring menacingly at his enemy. Abadar claps his hands and declares that the protagonist has impressed him, offering to serve him. The man enthusiastically praises Mizuno, his incredible, unprecedented strength, and adds that such talent must not be allowed to go to waste. Extending his hand, Abadar invites the protagonist to join him and says that together they will shake the entire kingdom. Mizuno cuts him off abruptly, unwilling to listen to all these deceitful, flattering words, and orders his enemy to shut up. Pointing his blade at Abadar, the protagonist states bluntly that he is next. His expression darkening, the man asks if the protagonist is refusing, and says he's sorry. Abadar runs his fingers along his staff, summoning the magical orb at its tip. He swings the staff. Smirking, Abadar remarks that he'll have to kill Mizuno, and with a wild grin, he asks not to hold a grudge against him, since the protagonist is to blame himself. The man strikes the ground with his staff. Simultaneously with the shockwave, a wall of fire appears around Abadar. The protagonist grows wary, carefully surveying the new obstacle. Through the smoke, the outline of a special gift for Mizuno, as Abadar himself put it, begins to take shape. Behind the man, a massive salamander, several times a man's height, appears. The creature's scales are ablaze, its eyes glint menacingly, and its jaws are already slightly parted. Sharp, large claws are visible on its paws. The salamander's level is 61. The monster's abilities, fire resistance and fire breath. The protagonist stares at the salamander. He is unimpressed and wonders if Abadar seriously believes that such a weak monster is capable of killing him. A collar of flame forms around the creature's snout. The salamander opens its mouth wide, revealing a row of sharp fangs. It fires balls of fire at the protagonist while stepping forward. Rocks fly alongside the flaming projectiles. An explosion rings out, and everything is engulfed in smoke. Abadar clicks his tongue in displeasure. He sees that Mizuno managed to dodge the attack. He wonders how the protagonist will like his next attack. Salamander, now completely engulfed in flames, fires another blast. Owen is lying on his side by a tree. It's a miracle that the burning projectiles don't hit him. Groaning through clenched teeth and struggling to open his eyes, the young man slowly comes to. Owen slowly and with difficulty sits up and leans his back against a tree trunk. Hearing the shout, he stares blankly and bewilderedly at the fireball. It's flying straight at him. There's an explosion. Mizuno somersaults, once again dodging the danger. All the while, the young man doesn't let go of his trusty blade. He coldly asks if that's all Abadar and his salamander are capable of. Laughing, the man calls the protagonist a fool. He snaps his fingers, and the entire area is engulfed in flames. Tongues of fire shoot up from the ground, sending rocks flying into the air. Smirking, Abadar asks how the protagonist is going to run across the burning ground now. The protagonist says thoughtfully that now is the perfect time. Abadar smiles in puzzlement and asks again. Mizuno explains that he feels the moment is right to test out his new skill. A little earlier, when the protagonist was rushing to escape the dungeon as it crumbled before his eyes, he decided he shouldn't delay the absorption. Without stopping, right on the move, the protagonist glances at the heart clenched in his hand and sinks his teeth into it. He swallows the organ. Mizuno stands facing Abadar. Abadar, his eyes wide with shock, can't fathom where the young man got such strength. All of the man's self-confidence and arrogance have vanished. A certain feeling makes Abadar grow anxious. The protagonist, looking grim, has already raised his hand, and a portal is forming behind him. Abadar quickly assesses his opponent's stats. Mizuno is at level 117 and possesses the skills Poison Master, Poison Warrior, and Shield. Now Abadar loses all his composure and his self-control. The man cries out, declaring that he won't let the protagonist carry out his plan. He unleashes a powerful stream of fire, fueled by Salamander. The flames surge toward Mizuno, poised to burn him to ashes. However, when Abadar looks up, he sees that the protagonist is safe and sound. The man is now seriously shaken. His voice trembles, and he cannot understand how the young man survived this attack. Behind Mizuno, a huge monster appears, as if melted by poison. This is Beelzebub, whom the protagonist defeated in battle in the dungeon. He is now at level 120 and has one skill, Poison Warrior. Abadar stares in horror at the enormous fly-like creature. The man realizes with shock that the protagonist also possesses summoning magic. Glancing back at Beelzebub, the protagonist notes that he had suspected the monster's level was lower than that of the original. With a wave of his hand, Mizuno orders the monster to attack. Beelzebub lunges forward. As soon as he sees the monster rapidly approaching, Abadar, cursing in fear, bolts. Turning around for a second, he freezes in his tracks. Beelzebub has already reached the salamander. The fly-like creature grabs its opponent by the neck with its clawed paw. Salamander growls. Beelzebub lifts it up and tears off its opponent's limb, dropping the carcass. The shockwave knocks Abadar, who had been watching the battle, off his feet. He falls to the ground and barely manages to lift his head, just in time to see Mizuno swing his leg. The next moment, the boot slams into Abadar's face. The man's head snaps back, and he falls backward with a gasp. The protagonist advances relentlessly. Breathing heavily, Abadar props himself up on his elbows. Blood pours from his eye socket. Abadar is gasping for breath. The protagonist looms over the man on all fours. Beelzebub is visible behind him. Abadar stammers, trying to say something. Mizuno stares coldly at the man. The man demands that the guy not dare look down on him. The protagonist asks curtly, hasn't Abadar realized yet what situation he's in? The protagonist orders that he be returned to his home world. Abadar asks again, puzzled. Only then does he remember the tearful young man from another universe, and the picture of what's happening begins to come together for him. The man smirks, and then he bursts out laughing. The protagonist stares at him in silence. After he finishes laughing, Abadar realizes who is standing before him and why he knows him. Grinning, he asks if Mizuno likes this beautiful world. The protagonist's patience runs out, and he yanks Abadar to his feet. The protagonist pulls on the man's collar, causing him to gasp. Mizuno says he won't do it again and demands to be taken home. Abadar, stammering, admits that he doesn't know how to do that. The protagonist notes that, alas, the man has misunderstood him again. The protagonist squeezes Abadar's throat. Abadar starts retching. Mizuno advises him to think carefully before answering. Abadar spits and clears his throat. Once he's caught his breath, he calls the guy an idiot. The man shouts that summoning magic is intended only to transport creatures to the mage. Abadar repeats that he can summon them to himself, but he has no idea how to send the protagonist back to his world. The protagonist freezes in shock. Then he draws his blade, and he slashes Abadar's arm with it with all his might. The man screams desperately in pain and curses. Shaking Abadar, Mizuno demands that the man tell him how to get to his world. The protagonist adds that the longer the man remains silent and resists, the deeper the poison will penetrate his body. With a trembling voice, Abadar admits that he told the truth and really doesn't know how to bring the protagonist back to his world. Mizuno yells that in that case, he no longer needs the man, and shakes him. Abadar screams. The protagonist presses the blade to the man's throat. The man says in a trembling voice that he's sorry, and asks for forgiveness. At that moment, the protagonist freezes, realizing that if everything Abadar said is true, he'll never be able to go home. Tears stream from the protagonist's eyes. Suddenly, Abadar realizes he hadn't said it was impossible to bring Mizuno back to his world. The protagonist freezes. Then he asks, "What do you mean?" Abadar says hoarsely, that this world, someone must surely be in control of all the seas, forests, cities, and dungeons. Mizuno must find the god. Abadar is serious. Hearing his words, the protagonist's eyes widen in astonishment, and asks skeptically, what? The man asks him to think it over carefully, because no one else could grant people such powers. Abadar explains that in the past, the great rulers of antiquity could even communicate with God personally. Special artifacts are required for the chosen ones, or, more precisely, to perform the ritual. The man adds that the protagonist should have already figured this out. Such an omnipotent being would surely be able to return the protagonist to his world. Mizuno remains silent, pondering Abadar's words. It all sounds like utter nonsense, but if this god truly exists, then the protagonist will have to seek the help of other nobles. This prospect does not please the protagonist in the least. At this point, Abadar remarks that Mizuno won't succeed. Although the protagonist managed to raise his level very quickly, he's no match for the aristocrats from the capital. Abadar frantically warns that if the protagonist kills him, the other high-ranking nobles won't stand idly by. Mizuno won't get away with this, considering he's a foreigner. No matter where the protagonist goes, death will be waiting for him everywhere. The protagonist confidently declares that it will actually be easier for him if the aristocrats come after him themselves. Abadar asks, hasn't Mizuno figured this out yet? That killing monsters isn't the same as killing people. The protagonist listens to the aristocrat in shock. Noticing his reaction and bursting into laughter, the man says that the protagonist is nothing but a foolish child. Mizuno shakes Abata again and demands that he shut up and just answer his questions. He smirks, recalling that despite all his threats, the protagonist hadn't killed him. The man declares that the protagonist is too kind. Smiling, he suddenly unleashes a burst of flame. Abata laughs loudly, clicking his tongue in irritation. The protagonist realizes he's been talking too much and has let his guard down completely. Abata soars into the sky, and he shouts that the protagonist has let his guard down. He unleashes a powerful burst of fire, hoping that Mizuno will die. The protagonist watches the approaching attack. He releases poison, and he concentrates on directing it at the burst of flame. The poison envelopes the fire. Abata is stunned to see the poison consuming the flames. He can't believe what's happening. But Mizuno is no longer listening to Abata. With a powerful swing, he cuts off the man's arm. The man, screaming in pain, collapses to the ground. Blood gushes from the wound. Staring in horror at the stump left where his arm used to be, Abata says in a trembling voice that he doesn't want to die. He begs the protagonist to forgive him. But the poison is already eating away at the skin on the man's face. Mizuno stands over Abata's remains, barely containing his emotions. A message appears stating that the protagonist's level has increased. The moon has already risen in the sky. The protagonist, breathing heavily, collapses on all fours in front of the pond. He gasps for air. The scene of Abata's death plays out before Mizuno's eyes. How he screamed in pain, how the skin peeled off his face, his skeleton with shreds of flesh clinging to it. The protagonist hears footsteps, and he turns around. Abata is standing behind him. His head has been corroded by acid. Empty eye sockets are visible where his eyes should be. The man asks, "Are you really going to touch your sister with the very hands that killed a man?" The protagonist's eyes widen. He looks closely, but there's no one in the clearing. Tears stream down the protagonist's face. He slumps over, sobbing. Mizuno realizes that he has killed a man, and there's nothing he can do about it now. He convinces himself that he had no other choice, especially since, if Abata had survived, he would have continued killing innocent people. The protagonist dips his hand into the water and stirs it thoughtfully. He realizes that in order to find a way back to his home world, he'll have to get used to killing people. Mizuno looks at his reflection. His own face seems pitiful to him. Leaves floating by cut through the protagonist's reflection. A black spot obscures it, and the face in the water contorts, blurs, and twists. After a moment of silence, the protagonist gets to his feet and walks away. His reflection, smirking, remarks that in this world everything depends on one's level and advises the protagonist to keep growing. Then they'll meet again. Mizuno turns around abruptly. A black spot is still visible on the surface of the water. Looking closely, the protagonist hesitantly concludes that he must have just imagined it. The protagonist wonders, what kind of world is this anyway? 5 days pass. Mizuno walks along the road. Something catches the protagonist's attention. He glances over. The bushes behind him are shaking, and a large creature leaps out of the thicket. The protagonist quickly turns around and dodges the animal charging at him. Glancing at his opponent, Mizuno realizes he's facing a monster. The information states that it's a kobold, which is level 5 and has one skill, Claw Strike. The protagonist now knows that monsters can be found outside dungeons as well. He notices that the kobold is very weak. The monster, crouching low to the ground, lunges at the protagonist once more. Its sharp claws are ready to sink into the protagonist. But the protagonist meets the kobold with his blade and cuts the monster in half with a single powerful strike. The creature's corpse falls at his feet, and acid instantly corrodes it. Mizuno remarks that Anra's deadly poison is truly a terrifying thing. The young man continues on his way. At night, the protagonist builds a fire. Sitting on a log and tossing logs into the fire, Mizuno thinks that it's not as dangerous outside as it is in the dungeon. However, the protagonist has been wandering around like this for a whole week now, but hasn't found anything. He has no idea where to even begin his search for the so-called god. Mizuno covers his face with his hand. The protagonist lies down by the fire. He gazes at the moon. He decides that everything was much simpler in the dungeon. Gradually, Mizuno closes his eyes and falls asleep. Someone emerges from the forest into the clearing. The stranger quietly approaches the sleeping protagonist. She freezes in front of him and touches his nose with her finger. But just as her hand nears his face, the protagonist grabs her wrist. His eyes flash, and he sits up. The stranger gasps in surprise and timidly asks if Mizuno is all right. He lets go of her hand and apologizes for scaring her. Answering the stranger's question, he says he's fine. After timidly apologizing and glancing at Mizuno's clothes, the girl asks if he is a runaway slave. The protagonist fully understands that he cannot reveal that he killed the local lord and fled. Out loud, He answers in the affirmative. After a moment of silence, the stranger remarks that the protagonist must be very tired. With a smile, she tells him that her house is nearby and invites him to rest there. Mizuno is surprised that the girl is inviting the first person she meets in the forest to her home. He finds the stranger to be a peculiar person. However, she is the first person Mizuno has met in a week. He decides it would be foolish not to take advantage of the opportunity. The protagonist thanks her and accepts the invitation. Soon, the pair arrive at the house. The protagonist and the girl go inside. The stranger asks him to wait a moment while she pours him some soup. The protagonist shyly nods and thanks her. Mizuno notices another pair of shoes and assumes that someone else besides the girl lives in the house. The stranger wishes him bon appetit and places a full bowl of soup in front of Mizuno. The main character warmly thanks his landlady. She sighs loudly. After apologizing, she asks him not to pay any attention to her. The main character takes his first spoonful. He remarks that the food is very tasty. The girl flinches, pressing her hand to her chest. The protagonist repeats his words, and, bewildered, he sees tears streaming down the stranger's face. He asks why the girl is crying. She falls to her knees and begs for forgiveness. She admits that the Lord ordered her to bring Mizuno to this house. The stranger adds that she is very sorry. Wiping her face, the girl declares resolutely that she cannot do such a thing. She tells the protagonist that when morning comes, he'll have to run away. He asks, looking grim, what she means by that. The stranger notes that since the protagonist is a stranger to this place, there is much he does not know. The local lord, Count Ilby, is truly a terrifying man. Mizuno recalls Abadar's words about the aristocrats and their attitude toward outsiders. He grows serious. The girl passionately repeats, once more, that the protagonist needs to flee. However, the protagonist cuts her off. He asks her to tell him more about this Count Ilby. The girl agrees and begins to answer. In the village where she comes from, people are taken away as taxes. Each time, more and more people are taken away. If the villagers resist, the nobles treat the rest of them very cruelly. Thinking of Abadar, Mizuno gloomily concludes that things are the same everywhere. He remarks aloud that killing the weak won't raise the level. The girl explains that nobles are born with privileges and need strong soldiers. There's no reason for aristocrats to risk their lives hunting monsters when they can kill 100 commoners instead. The protagonist listens to the girl's bitter story. He clutches his head. Finally, he asks why the villagers don't just run away. His companion replies sadly that it wouldn't do any good. In the village, everyone is ready to snitch on someone else just to save their own life. Mizuno, overcome with emotion, grabs the girl by the shoulders and shakes her. And he asks why she told him all of this. After all, she should have thought about her loved ones first. The protagonist passionately exclaims that caring for one's loved ones is only natural. With a gentle smile, the girl remarks that the protagonist is a good person. Pressing her hand to her chest, she admits that she and her brother used to live in this house. He was about the same age as Mizuno. Hearing his companion speak of her loved one in the past tense, the protagonist freezes. The girl explains that in the past, monsters often attacked the village. The girl's brother risked his life fighting the monsters. But as soon as his level rose slightly, someone immediately ratted him out. Recalling her brother's death, the girl clenches her fists and cries out bitterly that he always fought to protect the village and its inhabitants. And they simply handed him over to the nobles just to save their own skins. Tears stream from the narrator's eyes once more. The girl, stumbling over her words from time to time, says she doesn't want Mizuno to suffer the same fate as her brother and asks for forgiveness once again. After a moment of silence, the protagonist thanks his companion for telling him everything. He adds that it's been a long time since he's spoken to anyone. With a warm smile, the main character thanks her for the soup, repeating that he really did enjoy the meal. The girl can't say a word. She simply bursts into tears. Mizuno thinks this is the first time he's met someone so kind and sincere in this world. Looking at the girl covering her face, he realizes he can't blame her for the hardships of life. The protagonist's companion squeezes past him, much to the guy's surprise. Turning around and smiling wearily, the girl remarks that the protagonist has a fairly high skill level, and his blade isn't half bad, either. She adds that with his torn clothes, Mizuno will stand out too much. The girl is looking for something in the chest. She hands the items to the protagonist, explaining that they're her brother's clothes. The protagonist is about to object, but the girl gently stops him. She says her brother would be happy that his sister is helping someone as kind as Mizuno. As she hands the folded clothes to the protagonist, the girl asks him to take care of himself. The protagonist remains silent. But suddenly, the pair hears the sound of hooves. They quickly turn toward the door. Mizuno thinks they're monsters, but immediately dismisses the idea. The girl, however, her face contorted with horror, immediately recognizes the sound. Several aristocrats with sinister smiles have already gathered outside. They demand that the couple come out, for the nobles have come to collect taxes. Stammering, the girl asks in horror why they've returned again, since they were in the village just a month ago. One of the newcomers kicks the door, demanding that the couple stop hiding or they'll set the house on fire. Another nobleman, goading the exhausted and terrified villagers, shouts that if the girl and the protagonist do not come out voluntarily, they will die. Smelling the scent of burning, Mizuno realizes that the aristocrats aren't joking. He's already reaching for the doorknob when the girl stops him by taking his hand. Frightened, she begs the protagonist not to go outside, or they'll kill him too. The young man pulls his hand away, reassuring the girl that everything is all right. Turning around and smiling, the protagonist adds that he's quite strong. An aristocrat on horseback rides past the nobles and the villagers kneeling on the ground. The people are terrified. The children cling to their parents out of fear. The rider, Rhaegar, the commander of Count Ilby's personal army, smirks and asks where the village headman is. An elderly man kneeling on the ground responds in a trembling voice and timidly points out that the aristocrats had already collected taxes last month. Rhaegar replies that this number of people was not enough to meet the soldiers' needs. The terrified village head notes that there are already very few villagers left. The nobleman demands an answer furiously. The village head tries to apologize, but it's too late. With a swing of his sword, Rhaegar cuts his throat. The old man's head falls to the ground. The villagers scream in horror. Rhaegar laughs deafeningly, and he repeats his intentions mockingly. The young man points out that if the aristocrats kill any more people, the village will be wiped out entirely. But the young man doesn't have time to finish his sentence. With a chuckle, Rhaegar beheads him too, right before the eyes of the girl standing next to him. The nobleman raises his blood-stained blade and repeats that he doesn't care about the village's fate. He announces that there's a high-level dungeon nearby, so the aristocrats need to level up as soon as possible. Rhaegar declares the start of the hunt for experience. The terrified villagers scatter in panic. One of the girls falls to the ground. The aristocrat approaches her, realizing that his precious experience has finally fallen into his hands. The nobleman is already raising his sword above the girl, but Mizuno is already rushing to intercept him. With a powerful kick, he knocks the aristocrat off his feet. The aristocrats freeze, staring intently at the protagonist, and they wonder, who is he? Rhaegar takes a step toward the protagonist, noting that the nobleman was above level 40. Mizuno looks up at the commander with a grim expression. The commander, his face contorted with horror, asks, "Who is this protagonist?" One of the nobles charges at the protagonist with a sword in his hands. He orders him to stay put and become his experience. But Mizuno meets the attacker with an elbow strike to the neck. The aristocrat collapses to the ground, and the protagonist chokes him. Blood flows from the nobleman's eyes, and saliva bubbles at his lips. The rescue girl screams and runs away. Mizuno says that he used to blame himself for killing a man, but now he understands that the nobles are monsters rather than people. The protagonist holds his blade out in front of him. Frowning, Rhaegar shouts that the protagonist is an insolent fool and a pathetic scoundrel. He lunges forward to attack, but Mizuno parries his blow. Rhaegar clicks his tongue in displeasure. Squinting, the protagonist notices that the aristocrat's horse is no ordinary horse. He studies the information about the commander. Rhaegar Lars is at level 91 and has a skill called Dance of the Blades. The warhorse is at level 62, and its skill is Breakthrough. Mizuno realizes that Rhaegar's level is higher than that of a Botter's henchman. The protagonist hadn't expected to encounter anyone with a level as high as his own. Rhaegar sees that the protagonist managed to withstand his blow. He can't understand where such a nobody could have gotten such power. Rhaegar sees Mizuno's status and is speechless. He can't believe the guy is already at level 18. The nobles are also in shock. One of them can't understand why such a monster is in the village. An idea pops into Rhaegar's head, and he laughs. He shouts that this is the best possible outcome. He's tired of dealing with low-level trash. Rhaegar knows full well that if he kills Mizuno, he'll become many times stronger. The aristocrats surround the protagonist. The commander notes that the protagonist won't be able to defeat all the nobles on his own. He mockingly points out that a pathetic country bumpkin dared to raise a blade against a soldier. The protagonist stares intently at Rhaegar. He tells the commander to relax, and declares that he doesn't want to become a murderer. Rhaegar asks again, puzzled. Glancing at the corpses of his soldiers, the protagonist adds that he would gladly send monsters like these nobles to the afterlife. Rhaegar is taken aback by this statement. Mizuno swings his sword. The commander calls the protagonist a lowly upstart and demands that he shut up and not dare utter a word with his filthy mouth. Pushing off from the ground, the protagonist dashes past Rhaegar. Rhaegar tenses up. No sooner has Mizuno landed, one of the soldiers lunges at him with a shout. The protagonist activates his shield, and he blocks the attack. Then, with a kick, he sends a soldier flying. Rhaegar calls the protagonist a scoundrel. The protagonist stops and asks, "Is this really all the vaunted soldiers of the Proud Count are capable of?" Rhaegar grimaces with indignation, and, hurling fresh insults, he swears to cut off Mizuno's insolent tongue. Another soldier sneaks up on the protagonist from behind, intending to kill him. Without turning around, the protagonist parries the attack and knocks the assailant off his feet. The protagonist stops and looks up. Rhaegar, his face contorted into a maniacal grin, orders his men to surround Mizuno. To the commander's astonishment, the protagonist sends 3 more soldiers fleeing. A new group of Rhaegar's men rushes at the protagonist. He realizes that the soldiers are trying to attack him from all sides to cut off his retreat, so he decides to take a different approach. The protagonist slashes a soldier in the side with his sword. The soldier falls with a scream. Blood pours from his eyes, and foam forms on his lips. The soldier clutches his throat. His eyes roll back, convulsively reaching out with trembling hands toward his terrified comrades. The soldier begs them to help him. His companions nervously wonder what just happened. Then one of the soldiers shouts that it's a curse, and they're all going to die. Immediately, Rhaegar's men scatter in panic. The commander orders the soldiers to return, reminding them that cowardice in the face of the enemy is punishable by death. But it's all in vain. Mizuno sees that the men are not willing to risk their lives for Rhaegar. He notices that killing just one soldier was enough to immediately crush the morale of the entire unit. The protagonist calls out to Rhaegar. Pointing his blade at him, he declares that now it's just the 2 of them. The commander shouts that he will kill the protagonist, and, spurring his horse on, charges into battle. Mizuno runs toward him. He slips under the horse, wounding it. The horse neighs in pain, and throws its rider off. He falls to the ground. Cursing, he sees the approaching danger. With a powerful swing of his sword, the protagonist wounds Rhaegar. The commander's blade plunges into the ground next to its master. Rising to his feet, Rhaegar reaches for his weapon with his last ounce of strength. But Mizuno intercepts the sword and pulls it out. The protagonist says that Rhaegar cannot escape him, and he pierces the commander's palm with the blade. The commander screams in pain. Blood pours from his mouth and nose. Rhaegar, struggling to speak, calls the protagonist a damn monster. He looks up at the grim, motionless Mizuno. The commander's skin is melting from the acid. Smirking, Rhaegar, with his last ounce of strength, tells the protagonist not to pretend to be human. After all, he's just like the commander. And so Rhaegar meets his end. Mizuno looks at the commander's body, and in response to the dead man's words, he admits that he, too, understands all of this. The protagonist turns away from the body and sees the villagers taking cover behind some debris. The protagonist smiles at the people. But then one of the young men asks in a trembling voice, "What has Mizuno done?" The other villagers also seem frightened. The protagonist looks at them in confusion. The young man shouts that the Count will never forgive them for this. A girl hugged her mother, bursts into tears, and exclaims that they're all going to die. One of the men reminds his companions that they themselves have seen just how strong the protagonist is. He is certain that if they anger Mizuno, he'll kill them all on the spot. Mizuno listens to the villagers in shock. Lowering his gaze, he realizes there's nothing he can do about it now. These people are broken. The protagonist can no longer help them in any way. The baby starts to cry. His mother, with tears streaming down her face as well, rocks the baby, promising that everything will be all right. Mizuno turns to leave. There's no point in staying in this village anymore. The protagonist walks along the path. Suddenly, he freezes in his tracks. The protagonist sees cracked walls, and a door torn from its hinges, revealing a pitch-black opening. Mizuno realizes that this is the house of the girl who brought him to this place. The protagonist's eyes widen. He realizes that not all the soldiers were fighting him, and he recalls the noble's threats. The protagonist realizes that the soldiers who went from house to house, searching for villagers, are still out there. Terrified, Mizuno springs to his feet. He pushes open the crooked door and freezes on the threshold. A horrific scene unfolds before him. The entire room is covered in blood, and the woman of the house lies motionless on the floor. The protagonist picks the girl up in his arms, noticing a wound on her head. He begs her to hold on. Her hand hangs limply at her side, and bloodstains are visible on her skin. The sight terrifies the protagonist. He wants to say something, but can't get a word out. The protagonist realizes that the girl is dead. He stares at her face, but there is not a single sign of life there. Mizuno refuses to believe it. Suddenly, a small bundle, which looks perfectly clean against the backdrop of the room, falls to the floor. The protagonist picks up the fallen object, and he realizes that it's the girl's brother's clothes. He recalls the words of the woman of the house. The protagonist says he can't accept these items now. He carries the girl's body to the bed and gently places her brother's clothes on her chest. Mizuno looks sadly at the deceased. He realizes that even by sacrificing her own life, the girl managed to protect what was most precious to her. The protagonist recalls how the landlady used to pour him soup. His hands clench into fists on their own. The protagonist thanks the girl for the soup, and he adds that he really did enjoy the meal. Tears stream down his face. Mizuno walks through the village. He recalls that a Bader said the only way to return to his homeworld is to meet God, and that only very influential people are able to appeal to him. The protagonist realizes that after he interfered with the tax collection, the Count will definitely not leave the village alone. The main character will be to blame for all the deaths of the local residents. He has no intention of letting it go. You can't take innocent lives just for a little bit of experience. Mizuno sees the girl and her brother before his eyes. The protagonist decides that this whole world is one big mistake. In his mind, he asks Kana to wait just a little longer. Before returning to his own reality, the protagonist decides to destroy this monstrous world. Mizuno makes his way to the city of the castle, located in Count Ilby's domain. As he walks through the streets, he notices that there isn't a soul in sight. The city seems to have died out. Then the protagonist sees a man's body lying right at his feet. The protagonist frowns. A voice reaches Mizuno's ears. The speaker asks if his companion really has nothing with which to pay his taxes. The protagonist stops. He had hoped the capital would be a quieter place. The protagonist presses himself against the wall, watching what's happening. Around the corner, several guards are interrogating a man. One of the soldiers grabs the commoner by the collar, declaring that if he can't pay with money, he'll have to give his life. Tears stream down the man's face. In a trembling voice, he begs for one more week's reprieve. Mizuno, watching the scene, realizes that even in this city, commoners are treated like trash. The guard is not pleased with the man's request. He throws the commoner violently to the ground, knocking the wind out of his lungs. Shaking all over, the man begs for forgiveness. The guard sneers that apologies don't put food on the table. Terrified, the man asks what he is supposed to do. The soldier sighs, as if doing him a favor, and allows the commoner to have all the food he has. In that case, the guard promises to consider allowing him to pay in installments. The man reminds him that he has a daughter. The soldier laughs and replies that in that case, he might have some fun with her. He adds that since the commoner has nothing to pay with, he has no choice. The man begs to be given another option. Drawing his sword, the soldier declares that he'll put him to the test. The guard is already looming over the man when Mizuno appears behind him. The soldier notices him too late, and he takes a punch to the face. He falls to the ground. The other guards don't understand what's happening. The protagonist stops next to the fallen soldier. The guards ask, "Who is he?" The protagonist admits that his emotions have become significantly dulled since he arrived in this world. Murder no longer frightens him much, and his memories no longer terrify him. Mizuno grips his blade more tightly. The soldier shouts that the protagonist dared to raise a weapon against Count Ilby's guard and asks if the young man realizes what will happen to him for this. The protagonist replies that although he's used to killing people like these soldiers, but to stand by and watch the slaughter of the defenseless, he'll never get used to it. The guard doesn't understand what the protagonist is even talking about and declares that the young man has picked the wrong fight. The soldiers draw their swords and promise that the protagonist can't hope for an easy death. After all, he dared to stand up against their unit. The guard adds that he'll make Mizuno bitterly regret his audacity. The protagonist, clenching his fists, grimly assesses his opponent's stats. A soldier lunges at the protagonist, intent on killing him and earning more experience points. Mizuno calmly dodges the attack. Before the fight with the guards, he had been on his guard, since Rhaegar's level was over 90. But after checking the soldier's stats, the protagonist realized that the commander was the exception. No matter how many times the guard attacked, the protagonist deftly dodged every time. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, the soldier declares that Mizuno's only strength is his speed. Laughing, he decided to put his skill to the test. A flame surrounds the soldier's blade, and he wonders how the main character will like that. The guard shouts that the fiery wolf will tear the guy to pieces. The soldier advises the protagonist to be proud that he will die by such a skill. The guard uses the ability Fiery Wolf's Fawn. Mizuno, meanwhile, activates the shield ability, and with his hand, he stops the soldier's burning blade. The soldier is shocked, and the protagonist realizes that Fiery Wolf's Fawn isn't a skill at all, but just a big show. The protagonist is already ready to counterattack. The guard asks him to stop, but the protagonist ignores him and strikes with his sword. Sighing, Mizuno glances at the soldier writhing in agony. Dying from the poison of the Anra blade is quite a pleasure. Even against such subhumans, the protagonist doesn't want to use this weapon unless absolutely necessary. The protagonist turns to the remaining soldier. The blonde guard cries out in fear. He steps back, asking who this guy is. He demands that the protagonist not come any closer and threatens that Count Ilby won't let this slide. Grabbing the commoner, the blonde guard orders Mizuno to stop, or he'll slit his hostage's throat. However, the protagonist springs into action. He grabs the guard by the neck, and, tightening his grip, he lifts the soldier off the ground. The blonde man begs for mercy, but the protagonist stares at him in silence. Then the guard promises to tell him anything. Mizuno wants to know Count Ilbe's rank. The soldier realizes that the protagonist is the one who killed Commander Rhaegar. The protagonist reminds him that he's the one asking the questions and tightens his grip, causing the blonde man to gasp for air. In desperation, the guard shouts that he doesn't know Count Ilbe's rank, since it's a top-secret matter. He tries to loosen the protagonist's grip, but to no avail. In an icy voice, the protagonist asks if the soldier really thinks he can keep his mouth shut. The guard assures him he's telling the truth, since Count Ilbe trusts no one. If the guard lets anything slip, he'll be sent to the torture chamber. The blonde man reveals the only thing he knows. Mr. Tedder and Ms. Hiris serve as the squad commanders. However, he doesn't know their ranks either. Mizuno asks what else the soldier can tell him. The guard shouts that he has already told everything he knows. Discussing the Count's combat strength is strictly forbidden. The guard recalls the skills and says that they increase strength. Narrowing his eyes, the protagonist notes that Ilbe is much more cautious than Abadir. The blonde man exclaims that the Count never appears in public at all. Mizuno asks again, and he shakes the soldier. The soldier speculates that Ilbe's behavior is somehow related to his skills. The protagonist unclenches his fingers, and the guard falls to the ground. The protagonist says that's enough and grips his blade behind his back. The blonde man, trembling, struggles to his feet, and Mizuno instantly wounds him. The soldier doesn't understand why, but he dies shortly afterward. The protagonist glances at the guard's bloodied corpse. Then he turns away and wipes the blood from his face. Just then, a commoner timidly calls out to him. The protagonist recalls the villager's reproach, and he's already about to leave. However, the man bows deeply and thanks him fervently for saving him. Mizuno is surprised and decides to find out more. The commoner is ready to tell him everything. The protagonist asks if the man knows anything about Count Ilbe. The man apologizes and admits that he knows very little about him. The only thing the man knows is that Count Ilbe is the devil incarnate. The protagonist nods. He knows that levels enslave people and give rise to monsters. Mizuno thinks again of the dead girl from the village, and he clenches his fists. In his mind, he tells Count Ilbe to wait for him. Night falls, and the full moon shines brightly. The protagonist makes his way to Count Ilbe's castle. He stands behind some bushes and sees the silhouettes of people in a lit window. Mizuno uses the cover skill and pushes off the ground, and shatters the glass. He lands inside the room. The guards turn to face him and demand to know who this protagonist is. They shout that since the guy decided to attack Count Ilbe's own castle, he won't be leaving here alive. The guards threaten to kill the protagonist, but he kills them all with a single blow. One of the soldiers freezes in shock. He can't believe that Mizuno took down 3 of them with his bare hands. The protagonist merely glances at him and asks, "Where's Count Ilbe?" The guard bites his lip nervously and shakes his head. The protagonist warns that if the soldier doesn't speak, he'll kill him. The guard lets out a kind of wheeze. The protagonist feels a strange sensation. The guard is frightened, but that's not the only reason. Mizuno notices a flash and tries to figure out what's going on, and he turns around. To his amazement, he sees a portal on the floor. Inside it, the silhouette of a woman appears. The protagonist manages to step back, dodging the blow. The woman steps out of the portal and, snorting, notes that her opponent moves quite well. Mizuno freezes in a fighting stance. Hiris lowers her sword. She doesn't know who this guy is, but she knows he's clearly strong. The woman smiles. She loves strong men. However, alas, the protagonist is not an enemy. Hiris rushes into the attack, moving instantly. The protagonist realizes he won't have time to defend himself. Hiris's blade is already right up close. Mizuno flinches, miraculously avoiding a direct hit. And yet he gasps in pain, doubled over. Yet he smiles, feigning surprise. The protagonist forces himself to straighten up and checks his opponent's status. The woman is Hiris Rawless. She is level 134 and possesses a skill called teleportation. The protagonist tenses up. He had assumed that Hiris was roughly on the same level as Rhaegar and hadn't expected her to be this strong. The protagonist realizes that he is facing one of the commanders. She giggles and notes that Mizuno has already heard of her. Hiris checks his status, and upon seeing that the protagonist is at level 18, she acknowledges that he is quite strong. With a confident smile, she adds that with such a level difference, Mizuno's power is nothing to speak of. Hiris licks her lips predatory and says that a rumor had recently spread that someone had killed Rhaegar, which is why she had been on high alert. However, now she thinks she worried for nothing. She adds that her ability isn't meant for attacking, but for making sure she doesn't let her opponents get away. Hiris confidently declares that the protagonist won't be able to escape her. He listens to her warily. Then he swings his blade, repositioning it for a better grip. Hiris decides she wants to continue the fight and cheerfully remarks that it will be fun. The protagonist interrupts her, saying that this is bad news. If even Ilby subordinates are this strong, getting to the count won't be easy. This time, Hiris is genuinely surprised and asks again, incredulously. Mizuno understands perfectly well that, given her abilities, there's no escaping his opponent. He narrows his eyes. If anyone knows, and the protagonist knows better than anyone, it's that such a difference in power levels can be overcome. Hiris, pointing her sword at the protagonist, asks why he's so calm. She's certain that her pathetic, insignificant enemy has gotten way too big for his britches. The woman declares that Mizuno's skills don't faze or scare her in the slightest. She believes the protagonist is inferior to her in both technique and ability. She promises to show him right now that he doesn't stand a chance. Hiris rushes headlong into battle. She pushes off the floor with her heels. The protagonist grips his blade more tightly. He's used to fighting monsters that outlevel him, but this will be his first time facing a human in battle. With a maniacal smile and a fixed gaze, Hiris uses her teleportation ability. With a predatory look, she literally vanishes into thin air. Stunned, Mizuno quickly looks around, keeping his sword at the ready. It seems to him that Hiris has simply vanished. Somehow, the protagonist manages to dodge the woman's attack. She's already charging at him again. Smiling, Hiris remarks that the protagonist isn't half bad and is glad for the chance to stretch her legs a bit. Turning around, the woman orders the guards to leave the area. They're panting heavily and flinch in surprise. Mizuno realizes that Hiris clearly outclasses him in skill. The woman doesn't wait for the protagonist to come up with a plan. She's already charging in for another attack, asking on a run why the guy suddenly froze. Their blades clash. A smile plays on Hiris's lips, while the protagonist remains serious. He already realizes that the battle with Ilby's subordinate is nothing like a fight against a monster. Hiris has absolutely no weak points. The protagonist knows he needs to somehow get close to her. He runs toward Hiris. She bares her teeth and remarks that this is far too obvious a trap. Just as she's about to vanish into thin air, she realizes that Mizuno has absolutely no experience fighting humans. Flustered, the protagonist realizes that Hiris has literally anticipated his every move. And now the protagonist has to parry a barrage of attacks that the woman is unleashing from all sides at tremendous speed. The blades clash once again. Noticing the tense expression on Mizuno's face, Hiris asks mockingly, "Where has all your former agility gone?" She shouts that all the protagonist does is defend himself. The protagonist swings his sword wearily. Hiris sighs in disappointment and says she's disappointed. She declares she's had enough and uses her ability again. Now Mizuno is seriously terrified. He has no idea where Hiris has gone. The woman appears right behind the protagonist. With a smile, she suggests putting an end to it all. The protagonist turns around, but it's too late. Hiris's blade pierces him. Blood pours from Mizuno's mouth, and he begins to choke on it. Hiris presses herself close to him and says with a chuckle that she's actually getting bored. With a smile, she promises to turn the protagonist into a sieve. Hiris tugs at her weapon and, flustered, freezes. No matter how hard she tries, the blade won't budge. Puzzled, Hiris doesn't understand what's happening or why her rapier won't budge. She sees that her weapon is enveloped in crystals summoned by the protagonist. At that moment, she realizes what Mizuno has done and stares at her opponent in shock, instantly losing all her cheerfulness. The protagonist smiles through his bloodied mouth and confirms Hiris's suspicion. He really did deliberately let the blow land. The protagonist grabs his opponent firmly by the arm. The woman cries out, and the guy is already raising his blade. But Hiris doesn't wait for the blow. She uses her skill, and Mizuno's sword slices through the spot where his opponent had just been standing. Smiling again, Hiris admits that the protagonist is good. At that moment, the protagonist, gasping and clutching his rapier, collapses to his knees, exhausted. Glancing at him, the woman, drawing a new weapon, remarks that with a wound like that, Mizuno must already be at his limit. However, the protagonist smiles broadly, replying that Hiris is mistaken and he wouldn't say such a thing. The woman asks again, confused. At that moment, blood begins to flow from her eyes and mouth. The rapier slips from Hiris's weakened hands. In a second, the woman's entire face is covered in blood. Hiris doesn't understand why this is happening. After all, she had managed to dodge the protagonist's strike. Mizuno knows he took a terrible risk at that moment. However, he managed to graze Hiris's body with the tip of his blade at the very last moment, just as she was vanishing. Putting all the fun aside, the protagonist coldly declares that the battle is over. With a sweeping swing, he delivers the final blow to Hirus. The protagonist is breathing heavily as he stands over the body of his defeated opponent. Gritting his teeth, Mizuno grabs the hilt of the rapier with both hands and yanks it out with force. The weapon clatters to the floor. The protagonist gasps in pain, and he presses his palm against the bleeding wound. Thanks to his high level, Mizuno's body has become much stronger, and his regeneration has increased significantly. However, he had taken too much damage. Hirus outclassed the protagonist not only in level, but also in fencing skill. He looks once more at the woman's body, lying in a pool of blood. The protagonist realizes that he managed to win only because he was used to fighting to the death every single time. If this had been an ordinary duel, he would have lost. Mizuno wearily drops to his knees, weakened by blood loss. He knows he still has one more commander to defeat. Rhaegar was at level 91. Hirus was at level 134. If Tedder turns out to be even stronger, the protagonist is in for a tough time. At that moment, a scream rings out, and the sound of boots. The guards have spotted an intruder. Mizuno flinched at the loud noise and turned around. The soldiers come to an abrupt halt in front of the protagonist, stunned to find Hirus dead. The guards demand to know how the protagonist dared to kill their commander. Mizuno wearily scans the soldiers' stats. Even though they're just grunts, there are far too many of them. What's more, all the guards are at least level 40. The soldiers try to figure out who Hirus's killer is. The protagonist presses firmly on his wound. He realizes that his only option is to retreat. Mizuno jumps to his feet and dashes away. For a second, the guard are taken aback. Only then do they realize that the protagonist is escaping. Mizuno is glad he managed to get the information, but he also realizes that with injuries like these, he won't be able to make it any further. He runs to the window, preparing to jump out. Mizuno needs to get out before the second commander arrives. But then a black shadow glides across the floor. It comes to a stop right next to the bewildered protagonist. A tall silhouette looms over the wounded protagonist. The man who has appeared, with a half-mad look and a cold smile, notices that Mizuno, by the looks of it, has had quite a bit of fun. Glancing at the face of his new opponent, the protagonist decides that this is yet another commander. The guards, upon seeing the man who has appeared, recoil in shock, calling him Count Ilby. The protagonist is stunned. He clenches his teeth tightly, and he turns to face his enemy, pressing down harder on his wound. Mizuno had expected a second commander to show up, but Count Ilby himself has arrived in person. The protagonist knows that the exit is blocked, which means he'll have to fight here. He checks the Count's status, and the information he sees shocks him even more. Ilby Ilias is at level 223 and has two skills, Plunge into Darkness and Vampire. The protagonist can't believe it. The Count is much stronger than his commanders. His level is much higher than that of the mutant fly Beelzebub from the dungeon, who was at level 140. The difference in their levels is more than 70. Count Ilby sighs heavily as he stops by the window. He angrily declares that this whole situation is infuriating him. Calling the protagonist a pathetic piece of trash, Ilby asks how he dared to kill two of his subordinates. Mizuno remains sullenly silent. With a wild, broad grin, Count Ilby informs the protagonist that he shouldn't count on an easy and quick death. The protagonist looks up at Ilby. His whole body shudders. He understands perfectly well that he won't survive a protracted battle. If the fight drags on too long, Count Ilby will finish him off. Mizuno decides he needs to catch his opponent off guard and land a single, precise samurai strike. The protagonist grips his blade tightly. He must end the battle with a single strike. This is the protagonist's only chance to get the upper hand over Count Ilby. Mizuno uses his ability. A crystalline growth appears in his palm. The protagonist straightens up, assuming a fighting stance. He releases a burst of energy, but Count Ilby, tilting his head slightly, dodges it. The projectile explodes against the wall. The protagonist is already charging forward, ready to attack. But with a predatory smile on his face, Ilby parries the blow. A stunned Mizuno watches. Count Ilby's fingernails have turned into long red claws, which he used to deflect the blade. The protagonist realizes that this is what the vampire skill looks like. Smiling and clenching his fist, Ilby sneers that these are very pathetic and foolish tricks. The protagonist realizes it's already too late to dodge. Count Ilby's fist slams into Mizuno's neck. The young man's head snaps back from a blow, and the protagonist falls. Everything starts to blur before the protagonist's eyes, and his consciousness grows hazy. Gasping, Mizuno struggles to get back on his feet. He knows he needs to get back on his feet immediately. But to the protagonist's bewilderment, Count Ilby is no longer where he was. Ilby's voice rings out from behind him, announcing that he is there. Surprised, the protagonist turns around. Ilby, with a frozen smile, is already raising his hand to strike. Mizuno blocks the blow, but Count Ilby says the boy is too slow. Claws pierce the protagonist's chest, and blood spurts from the wounds. The boy falls heavily to his knees. He bows his head, and a stream of blood pours from his mouth. Count Ilby grabs the protagonist firmly by the hair. He yanks him upward, forcing him to lift his face. Mizuno only manages to mutter listlessly in surprise. The smile vanishes from Ilby's face, and he notices with disgust that the protagonist has made him get blood on his hands. He stares into the protagonist's eyes, at his blood-soaked face. Count Ilby calls his enemy a vile intruder. Ilby still won't let go of the protagonist. He feels as though all strength has completely left his body. Mizuno is kneeling in a pool of his own blood. Suddenly, a jubilant shout rings out from the soldiers, who have realized that Count Ilby has defeated the intruder. The guards report that this is the first time they've seen Ilby fight, and they exclaim that their master was simply incredible. Something about their words bothers Count Ilby. He asks whether the soldiers witnessed his ability. They confirm it. Ilby raises an eyebrow, smiles maniacally, and kills the guards in one fell swoop. The soldiers, who had just been sincerely admiring their master, fall dead, drenched in their own blood. With a cold smirk, Count Ilby says that the issue isn't that no one knows about his abilities. It's just that everyone who has witnessed Ilby's abilities is no longer alive. He adds that lately, the behavior of these cultists has begun to seem suspicious to him. Count Ilby believes it's best to keep his powers a secret. Having briefly turned his attention away from Mizuno to the soldiers, Ilby turns his focus back to his captive. He notices a blade lying at the protagonist's feet. Count Ilby releases the protagonist's hair from his grip, and the young man falls face first onto the floor. Bending down, Ilby picks up the weapon and runs his claws admiringly along the blade, noting that the sword is actually quite impressive. He's interested in the weapon's stats and checks its status. Count Ilby discovers that the blade is poisoned and grows serious. And in an instant, he flings the sword away from himself. Ilby notes that it's a very strange little thing. He intends to order his slaves to throw the weapon away later. Count Ilby kneels down next to the motionless Mizuno. He believes that the time is right to finally find out who sent the protagonist. Smiling, Ilby wonders if cultists, aristocrats, or perhaps even the royal family itself might be behind this. However, Count Ilby himself dismisses all these assumptions. Smiling, he lifts Mizuno up by the collar. Bringing his face closer to the protagonist, Ilby notes that the young man is most likely a person from another world. To confirm his point, Count Ilby adds that the protagonist has a strange name, one that strongly resembles those borne by people from another reality. Rumors circulate about this other world. Ilby himself has heard that people from that other reality have become completely complacent due to their peaceful lives. Count Ilby concludes that a banal sense of false justice might drive these otherworlders to commit such atrocities. The protagonist, listening to Ilby, asks for clarification. Count Ilby does not deign to answer him. He remarks that the protagonist should have gone to serve in some army. However, in Ilby's opinion, the young man made a mistake when he decided to draw his sword and rise up against the Lord. Count Ilby, shaking Mizuno, concludes that, in the end, the protagonist achieved absolutely nothing and fell into his hands. The protagonist frowns tensely, not knowing what to expect from Ilby. Count Ilby brings his face close to Mizuno's neck and asks if the young man really thought that by raising his level a little, he had become strong. The protagonist strains to break free, but Ilby roughly shakes him, causing more blood to spurt from the protagonist. Count Ilby insists he won't let his captive go. He pulls the now completely weakened Mizuno toward him. Ilby smiles maniacally. He says he hasn't fought in a long time and is terribly hungry. Count Ilby licks his lips and remarks that the fresh blood of high-level characters is especially delicious. With that, Ilby tilts his captive's head back and suddenly sinks his teeth into the protagonist's throat. The protagonist's eyes widen in surprise, and he gasps in pain, stunned by what is happening. Blood spurted from the bite wound. Suddenly, Count Ilby's eyes widen, and, spitting in disgust, he recoils from Mizuno. Ilby releases the charge from his fingers, and the protagonist, trembling, collapses to the floor. Count Ilby chokes desperately, clutching his neck and chest. He doesn't understand why the protagonist's blood is so disgusting and repulsive. Ilby's throat is burning and searing. Mizuno, meanwhile, sits down with difficulty, still trembling violently. An enraged Count Ilby asks what the protagonist has been eating that has made his blood so repulsive. The protagonist quickly grabs his sword. He stands up and points his weapon at Ilby, replying to the Lord that all this time he's been eating monster meat and drinking poisonous water. Mizuno looks at his opponent. Judging by Count Ilby's condition, the protagonist's poisoned blood has indeed taken effect. Ilby is pale, no longer smiling, and beads of sweat are rolling down his face. He's still clutching his throat. Without turning around, the The protagonist glances toward the window, the path to which is now clear. He realizes that he can escape now. Spinning around quickly, Mizuno dashes past the bewildered Count Ilby. An enraged Ilby shouts that he will never forgive the protagonist. He calls the young man by his full name. The protagonist runs without stopping. Count Ilby waves his hands, and black shadows glide across the floor in Mizuno's wake. The protagonist glances back as he runs. Just in case, he grips his blade tighter and picks up speed. Ilby clicks his tongue in irritation, realizing that the shadows can no longer reach the protagonist, since the guy is now out of their reach. Count Ilby, watching the protagonist retreat, decides to call off the pursuit. After all, he's certain the young man won't be able to escape anywhere anyway. The sound of footsteps can be heard. A guard appears behind Ilby and asks what happened. Count Ilby, smiling coldly, replies that an intruder has slipped in and orders that he be brought in alive. Ilby swears that he will make Mizuno suffer every possible torment before killing him. The protagonist hears the soldiers' shouts. The guards report that the outer perimeter is sealed off and the intruder has nowhere to run. The protagonist dives around the corner and crouches down. Glancing back, he clenched his teeth tightly when he realized that the soldiers had blocked all the windows and doors. Mizuno realizes that things are looking bad and he needs to get out of there immediately. Trembling all over, the protagonist takes a few steps down the hallway, holding onto the wall with one hand and pressing the other against his wound. The young man looks up, and he notices a room ahead of him, its doors sealed with chains. Touching the door with his palm, the protagonist wonders what kind of room it is. The sounds of footsteps and soldiers' voices are getting closer, and Mizuno realizes he has no time to think. Using his ability, he melts the lock. The protagonist cracks the door open and steps inside, trying to figure out where he's ended up. Seeing a staircase, the young man assumes he's in the basement. The protagonist looks down uncertainly. No sounds of the pursuit can be heard yet. However, there's only one exit from this room. If Mizuno delays any longer, he'll definitely be discovered. He realizes there's nothing he can do and decides to hide for now. The protagonist goes down the stairs and looks around, wondering why Count Ilby suddenly needed a place like this. The passageway is blocked by a metal-clad door. He freezes for a moment. The protagonist hesitantly reaches out and pushes the door. He is met by a pungent odor that makes Mizuno cough painfully. He covers his nose with his hand. The young man recognizes this unbearable smell. It's blood. The protagonist walks down the hallway, stopping at a grate. A sense of foreboding washes over him. However, the protagonist realizes that if he turns back, the guards will surely capture him. There's nothing else to do. All Mizuno can do is hide in the room. He pulls the ring and opens the door, and he steps inside, still covering his face. Lowering his hand, the protagonist freezes, his eyes widening in shock. He is horrified by the sight before him. The room is filled with all manner of torture devices, and the corpses of the unfortunate victims who fell into the hands of the executioners lie scattered on the floor. Mizuno looks around, and more brutal scenes come into view. The young man recalls that Count Ilby soldiers had mentioned something about a torture chamber, but he never could have imagined that it would be this terrifying. The protagonist can't take it anymore. Nausea overwhelms him. He slumps heavily to the floor and vomits. The young man pounds his fist against the wall. Tears stream from his eyes. He curses desperately, unable to believe that all this cruelty is real. Mizuno realizes that all the aristocrats in this world are hideous monsters. Finally, the protagonist finds the strength to stand up, leaning against the wall. He turns the corner, and once again he stops, stunned by a new, brutal sight. In the room is a stretcher to which something, once a human, is chained, its body now reduced to stumps. The wretched creature trembles slightly. Mizuno checks its status. The poor man's name is Jill Slane. He is level 18 and has the defensive stance skill. Seeing the creature tremble, the protagonist bitterly realizes that this piece of meat is still being kept alive. He assumes it's because of the wretch's relatively high level, but still doesn't understand why Count Ilby is doing this. Mizuno recalls the specifics of the vampire skill and concludes that the poor creature is being used as a reservoir of fresh blood or as an experience farm for soldiers. The protagonist curses and wipes his lips. Suddenly, the protagonist remembers something. He quickly pulls a vial of miraculous elixir from his pocket. Mizuno stares thoughtfully at the vial. He scans the room, spotting more and more victims of torture emerging from the darkness. The protagonist's lips are sealed. He clutches the vial of precious medicine convulsively. The young man had been saving the elixir for his sister, but now he's thinking of using it right away. He lowers his head, and he curses again. The protagonist hates himself for having come to terms with the deaths of others. He's used to people dying, but Mizuno doesn't want to abandon those who might still be saved. In his mind, the protagonist asks Kana for forgiveness. In tears, the protagonist decides that with the help of the elixir, he'll be able to bring someone back to life. Mizuno promises himself that he won't let his sister down. He approaches one of the tortured prisoners, whose face now resembles a skull, and he checks the prisoner's status. The poor man's name is Liz Lyrian. He is at level 23 and has a skill called martial arts. Stepping back and surveying the torture chamber, the protagonist surmises that everyone in this place is at such a high level. The protagonist freezes, struck by a sudden thought. He realizes that since these prisoners are being used as blood reservoirs and fodder for leveling up, they can't be weak. Mizuno understands that among the unfortunate victims, there must be those with powerful abilities. He frowns grimly as the last few tears roll down his face. It's hard for the protagonist to accept the fact that he'll have to decide who lives and who dies. He scans the crowd of unfortunate souls, blood-soaked, half-dead, trembling, and wrapped in dirty rags. The protagonist realizes just how cruel it all is. However, if he manages to carry out his plan, he'll be able to prevent further tragedies. Gripping the vial of elixir tightly, Mizuno makes his decision. He will resurrect the strongest of the captives. The protagonist sets out to search the dungeon, looking for the person with the highest level. He approaches a tortured man with a bloodstain spreading across his chest. The unfortunate man is missing one eye, and his mouth is half open. The prisoner's name is Oru Onan. He is at level 11 and possesses a skill called magic resistance. With a heavy heart, the protagonist turns away. This man isn't the one he's looking for. After apologizing to the unfortunate man, Mizuno prepares to walk away. But suddenly, a voice rings out from behind the protagonist. It's Oru, speaking with difficulty in broken sentences. He asks if there's anyone else in the dungeon. Confused, the protagonist returns to the stretcher. After a moment's silence, he replies that he is here. Poor Oru, bursting into tears, pleads pitifully in a trembling voice to be killed. He begs and begs, but a shaken Mizuno stands motionless. The protagonist sobs, and tears once again roll down his face, which had only recently dried. He quietly agrees to grant Oru's request. The protagonist looks sadly at the unfortunate man. The man thanks the young man in a trembling voice. With a decisive and swift swing of his blade, Mizuno ends the poor captive's suffering. The protagonist lowers his sword, from which droplets of Oru's blood are trickling. He is unable to tear himself away from the dead man. Tears continue to stream down his face. Suddenly, a noise rings out behind Mizuno. He whips around, gasping in surprise. A torture chair comes into view. A half-dead prisoner sits on it, his head bowed. He is missing one leg. His entire body is tightly bound with a chain. The poor man keeps repeating that he'll kill every last one of them. Sensing the protagonist's presence, the prisoner jerks his head up with a scream, vowing to tear everyone to pieces. Blood flows from the unfortunate man's empty eye sockets. The skin on his face is almost peeled away, his nose is gone, and his jaws are exposed. Mizuno shudders in surprise. He notes the prisoner's astonishing thirst for blood. The protagonist surmises that this tortured man might very well agree to fight on his side. He calls up information about the prisoner. The status causes the protagonist's eyes to widen in astonishment. The captive's name is Enju Elnoth. He is level 88, and on top of that, possesses two abilities, Gale and Dark Magic. Mizuno stares in shock at the unfortunate man bound in chains and notes that his strength is simply off the charts. The protagonist approaches the prisoner. Enju instantly turns toward him, baring his teeth. The protagonist gently asks the captive to calm down and says he didn't come to kill him. However, his words do not move the captive in the least. Enju whispers more curses and struggles to break free from his chains. With a heavy sigh, Mizuno realizes that dialogue is out of the question. Looking closely at the prisoner, the protagonist wonders if it's even safe to heal him. The mad look in his eyes and his bared teeth lead the protagonist to believe that Enju has completely lost his mind. Mizuno pleads with the prisoner as loudly as he can to help him kill Count Ilby. For a second, Enju falls silent, his mouth slightly agape. Then he asks maliciously, does the protagonist really think he's an idiot? The captive starts thrashing about again, struggling to break free from his chains and screaming that he'll kill everyone, including the guy. The protagonist clicks his tongue wearily. He realizes that talking is pointless here. In any case, Enju, in this state, won't hear a thing and won't come to any conclusions. The prisoner stares intently at Mizuno. The guy looks at the vial of elixir. Enju continues to rage and scream that he'll kill everyone, the count and the protagonist alike. Mizuno ignores the screams and summons the captive's status screen again. Enju does indeed have a high level and good skills. The captive continues to spew curses. The protagonist cautiously reaches out his hand toward him. even though he isn't sure Inju will become his ally. But one thing he knows for sure, the prisoner will be Count Ilbe's enemy. The bowman clicks his teeth, trying to bite Mizuno. Mizuno moves his hand closer to the prisoner's face anyway. The protagonist asks Inju not to move, and he grabs his chin firmly. Ignoring the captive's protests, the young man pries open his jaws and opens a vial containing a miraculous elixir. He warns Inju that it will hurt and tells him he'll have to bear with it. The protagonist carefully pours the contents of the vial into the captive's mouth. The captive swallows the elixir and starts protesting again. But suddenly, a glow surrounds Inju's body. The prisoner's leg grows back. Inju screams and throws his head back. The captive's skeleton-like torso is once again covered with flesh and skin, and the chains tighten. Mizuno watches the elixir's effects with wide eyes. He is still holding Inju's chin. In addition to the glow, a smoke screen now envelopes the captive. The protagonist notices that Inju seems to have gone quiet. Coughing, he raises his hand to his mouth. Suddenly, a fist hurtling toward Mizuno's face cuts through the smoke screen. At the last second, the protagonist senses the danger and manages to shield his face with his hands and dodge the blow. When a young man straightens up, he discovers a silhouette emerging from the settling fog. The glow fades, and the figure becomes clearer and clearer. Finally, the protagonist sees a girl dressed in blood-stained rags. She slumps wearily and casts a gloomy glance around the torture chamber. Her stern gaze falls on Mizuno as well. Both the former captive and the protagonist are at a loss. The protagonist realizes that Inju is, in fact, a girl. The freed girl lets out a sound, her eyes glazing over. Suddenly, with a scream and a frenzied look in her eyes, she lunges at Mizuno. Mizuno hadn't expected this turn of events at all and opens his mouth in bewilderment. However, the protagonist quickly recovers from his surprise, pulls himself together, and switches from defense to offense. He meets the girl with a blow and knocks her off her feet. Inju falls heavily to the floor. Gritting her teeth in anger, she turns around hastily, but she's still not fast enough. With a tense expression on his face, the protagonist firmly grabs Inju by the wrists and pins his former captive to the floor. After making sure he has her pinned in place and that she won't break free, the young man tells her that everything is all right. Mizuno promises Inju that he won't hurt her. Looking his former captive straight in the face, the protagonist assures her that he is not her enemy. Inju listens to his words, her eyes wide open and her mouth slightly agape in surprise. Sweat rolls down her face. Noticing that the girl's hands are already trembling from the awkward position, and realizing the position they'd frozen in, the protagonist hurriedly apologizes and lets go of Inju's wrists. She, still looking flustered, sits down and shakes her hands, examining them. Mizuno gently asks if she's calmed down. Inju grabs her face, feeling it, and repeats that this simply can't be true. The former captive simply cannot understand how any of this is possible, since she was practically dead. Standing up, Inju touches herself with her hands and examines her palms. Then her gaze falls to the floor, and she notices the now empty vial. She realizes that the vial had contained a miraculous elixir. Mizuno explains that he gave the medicine to the girl. She listens to him in surprise. The protagonist takes off his outer shirt and hands it to Inju. The girl accepts the garment and presses it tightly to her chest. She sighs, noting that the young man has spent something as precious as a miraculous elixir on her. It seems to the main character that Inju is acting like a completely different person compared to before. Mizuno turns away to let the girl get dressed in peace. Inju pulls the shirt on and shyly tugs at the collar with her fingers. She gasps. Bowing deeply, the former captive thanks the protagonist for saving her. Still standing with his back to her, he waves it off, assuring Inju that everything is fine. He adds that saving the captive was in his own interest. The protagonist doesn't get a chance to finish his sentence. Inju walks up to him and takes his hand. The young man turns to her in surprise. The girl thanks him again from the bottom of her heart. Mizuno is stunned by the look on Inju's face. The girl has a completely frenzied, fixed stare. With the fingers of her left hand, she clings tightly to the protagonist's wrist, while her right hand frantically grabs at the collar of his shirt. Inju vows grimly that she will take revenge on all these monsters. Shrugging nervously and freeing his hand from her grip, the guy replies that he's counting on his partner. The protagonist notices that Inju is looking up information about him. After reviewing his status, the girl calls out to Mizuno. She remarks admiringly on how extraordinarily high his level is. He smiles slightly and replies awkwardly that a lot has happened to him since then. Pointing at Inju, the main character asks, in turn, what happened to her? The girl awkwardly runs her fingers through her hair, stammers, and then lets out a sob. She tries to speak, but nothing comes out. She's shaking violently. Inju clutches her head and slumps over. The protagonist gently places his hand on hers and asks her not to force herself. However, the girl shakes her head. Still keeping her hands over her face, she says she's fine. Inju adds that Mizuno is her savior, and she wants to tell him everything. The rescued captive begins her story. The clan she comes from lived quietly and peacefully on the outskirts of these lands. However, Inju's settlement was a terrible thorn in Count Ilby's side. The fact was that many people fleeing Ilby's tyranny were flocking to the clan. The number of fugitives was growing steadily. Because of this, the settlement's inhabitants faced the threat of complete annihilation. Inju was gifted with strong, powerful abilities. To ensure her clan's survival, the girl killed the settlement's elder and her own father with her own hands. Inju did all this to level up. But it was all in vain because Tedder destroyed them. The protagonist realized that this was the last commander he hadn't yet faced. Inju recounted how he had mocked them, calling them pigs fit only for experimentation, and then killed them. Inju lowered her gaze to the floor and began to hurl insults at Tedder. Mizuno grabbed her by the shoulders and called her name. Inju snapped out of it. Then she bowed her head and apologized. Mizuno replied that she had nothing to apologize for. The girl asked if they needed to set out right away. Mizuno cried out and clutched his wound. Then he asked if he could rest for a bit. Inju nodded. The protagonist sat down against the wall and closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw Kana's joyful face. He remembered the day he visited her in her hospital room and gave her a teddy bear, which made Kana very happy. Tears welled up in his eyes. He woke up with a start, wiped his eyes, called out to the girl, and asked how long he had been asleep. But there was no one around. He jumped to his feet, and he ran, calling out to her. When he found her, he saw that she was raising her blade above her head and striking the captive with all her might. Drops of blood splattered onto the protagonist's face. He asked her, "What are you doing?" Inju explains that her level is too low and asks if Mizuno really wanted to take the prisoner's experience for himself. Inju reaches out toward the protagonist and says she's only doing this to kill Ilby, and that afterwards she'll give him all her experience points. After all, he's her savior. The protagonist cuts her off abruptly. He says that what she's doing is no different from Count Ilby's actions. The girl calls out to him in shock. The protagonist says that he, too, has killed people out of mercy, recalling Oru. But if they had left the prisoners here, they would have died in agony. Mizuno clenches his fist. Inju looks down indifferently and turns away. Mizuno says that if murder becomes just a way for them to gain experience, then they will lose their humanity forever. Inju spots the last prisoner and raises his blade above her head. Drops of blood spatter in all directions, and the protagonist realizes he won't be able to convey these thoughts to her. Inju lowers her bloody blade. She opens her status screen and notices she's at level 96. She turns toward the protagonist and says it's time for them to go. Mizuno nods wearily. At that moment, heavy footsteps echo from behind the iron door, and a man's voice asks where Mizuno is. The protagonist freezes in shock, and the voice continues to sing about how he will love Mizuno very, very much. Suddenly, Inju trembled. Then she bared her teeth wildly and stammered that it was Tedder. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.